bum. I'm out. Hello. Was that supposed to be Biznatch? I swear that was supposed to be Biznatch. I forgot to turn my filters back on. Boom. Hello, Blood Wolf. What's my other stream alert? This one, and 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 this one. Especially this one. Okay. Hello. Hi. These fucking editing sessions are keeping me up late at night. I'm stupid. Well, I'm gonna make horror say slurs. Was that a cough that I just heard next to my window frame? Of course not. No one would be so crazy as to walk up on my property. They'd be likely of getting shot or more. Anyways. I have grand and grave news. My Archnemesis has returned to content creation. Noralities. A name I haven't said in years has returned to the fold. Let's talk about it.
I've always been captivated by fairy tales, and I think to a certain extent, due to their very nature, everyone is. There's something wonderful and
I take it you have some background story with Noralities, or? Now Botrix sinks to the channel. That's so lame, Botrix. I take it you are aware of Noralities and her takes. Avid Carl watchers know that Carl has a vendetta against this content creator and people like them. No. Daphne Signifier is always there in the background doing some bullshit. Jay and I usually just end up ignoring him unless it's stupid enough to involve a take that's worth it. That's the first stuff you watch of mine? She watched the vintage! This is an hour and 29 minutes long. It seems that she's deciding to go for a book talk pivot. So what does my nemesis that really loves to watch girls love anime but really hates that it happens to also be the subject of content enjoyed by men who have autism? What does she have to say about Snow White and Sleeping Beauty?
I've always been captivated by fairy tales, and I think to a certain extent, due to their very nature, everyone is. There's something wonderful and truly magical about the human experience of continuously passing down these stories from parent to child, generation to generation, spanning thousands of years across time, all across the world through different kingdoms and cultures. Stories that were most likely told in the oral tradition of storytelling long before they were ever put to paper. They managed to survive even if the language...
Girl, this is a lot of preamble. You're going on double. You're going on 1.5, and if you keep fucking yapping, I'm putting you on double.
The kingdom they were first spoken in is now gone because people were still sharing them with others. We learn most of these stories when they're read to us in our childhood by our families, often before we can even read them ourselves, which makes them
It is, in fact, moralities.
familiar, comforting, and nostalgic as we grow older. And yet, I remember the odd wrongness I felt when I learned for the first time that the version of the story I had been told, and that I knew inside and out, wasn't true. That there was an older, darker, primeval version that my version originated from, but had been softened out of a protective form of love to shield children from the grim realities of the real world. And I desperately wanted to know what the true version was.
Oh god, she's doing all the TikTok sound edits.
But now I know that trying to find a true version of a
Fucking how long has it been between your content? I'm actually behind the times on this, because this one was posted 2 weeks ago. 3 weeks. Compared to your last video from 2 years ago. And you didn't change your fucking PNG avatar. Okay. Maybe the shading's different. Maybe I'm not noticing. I have to really look at them.
fairy tale is simple folly because one version can't be more or less real than another. The version I read of Little Red Riding Hood about a little girl getting eaten by a wolf isn't any more or less real than a modern version I happened to flip through at a bookstore, and was shocked to find that the wolf didn't even get around to eating anyone, instead locking the grandmother in the closet and chasing Red Riding Hood around until the woodsman burst onto the scene. With fairy tales, there is no true or false, only familiar and unfamiliar, older or newer, an unending number of fractured variants and retellings. For instance, there are, at the very least, a couple dozen variants of Little Red Riding Hood that we know of, but the bones of that story have remained surprisingly similar over time. One of the reasons for this is because of how simple the core premise is. A child gets tricked and devoured by a predator, the end. There just isn't that much room for drift to occur between versions, especially with the ending pattern baked in. My, what big teeth you have! All the better to eat you with, my dear. Most often, the predator is a wolf, but sometimes
She's still doing the voice acting. It's still garbage. Moralities, you don't have a voice to do that with. Please. Don't. It doesn't help your aesthetic.
ogre or tiger.
Never worked.
Sometimes the child is saved, and often she is not. But what I want to learn more about is not the story itself, but the drift. What changed over time and why? If we trace a few versions back over space and time in a spiderweb game of telephone, can we pin down how these versions shifted ever so subtly in the retelling? Today, let's take a look at the story of Sleeping Beauty, starting with the most recent version from 1812 by the Brothers Grimm, and then we'll compare it with 3 other versions that predate it, including the oldest known version of the Sleeping Beauty tale. And let's see if we can trace how, and maybe even why, they've shifted over time. Brothers Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm published their first edition of Little Briar Rose in 1812 in their collection of children's and household tales, and a slightly revised version which created a couple discrepancies in the 1819 second edition. The Grimm's version is extremely well known and probably what most modern audiences think of as the Sleeping Beauty story.
No, they don't. They think of Disney. What the fuck made you think that they think of the Brothers Grimm? Ironically enough, I've been watching Grimm from the CW, and I don't know how to explain how fucking cool the idea of German mythology is, but the fucking idea that people chose to go with softening the story with the Disney interpretation instead of going into the crazy, wacky, and wild world of Grimm, and also then sleeping on stories and series that play with German mythology is wild to me, right? They always go to Japan, they always go to Norway and Norse, they always go to Greek, they always go to Rome, they go to some version of African storytelling and Negro spiritual storytelling and Cajun Creole, Bayou, Haitian hoodoo magic storytell, but they have never really gone into German storytelling. I'm almost quite certain if you actually track the career trajectory of Gemma Arterton and you look at how many things she's been a part of that ironically happen to deal with German folklore, it's a direct line with the relevancy of how often that mythology actually gets represented. I'm not even fucking joking. Because almost all of us have probably seen the movie, right? Almost all of us have seen the Brothers Grimm movie. if I'm remembering that title correctly. Almost all of us, at some point in our life, saw The Brothers Grimm with Matt Damon, Heath Ledger, Lena Headey, Monica Bellucci, Jonathan Pryce, Peter Stormare, and a bunch of other fucking people, right? And the fever dream that that film is directly comparable to, what was it, Jack and Jill Monster Hunter? Something like that? Hansel and Gretel Witch Hunters. Excuse me. Every single time we end up getting a movie, a television show genre, or some such shit, we always get versions of them that are either, here's the folk store, but it's told from the culture perspective of the people that we've written it for, or here's the fairy tale that you are familiar with, but because it's owned by Disney, it's basically spinning it in an ABC property. So, Once Upon a Time, and Once Upon a Time in Wonderland, and Once Upon a Time in Agrabah, I think it had. There was really weird spin-offs of Once Upon a Time. And then occasionally, when they dip into video game that has any amount of lore to do with the relevancy of something like, say, Prince of Persia, maybe they get a little bit Arabic. Just a touch, just a smidge. And every single time, when you look through there, I know that I said it Gemma Arterton, but it was actually Lena Headey. I was confusing over Lena Headey. But ironically, Hansel and Gretel and then her in The Sands of Time, there is a direct parallel where Hollywood refuses to do storytelling that involves fairy tales unless it has something to do with Del Toro, or it has something to do with the casting of Gemma Arterton, because they literally cannot find anyone that can pass as hot in German. Period. Like, whenever they do a story about anything, they always do an Americanized version based on how the mythos had been spread. They never do it based on the original fucking German storytell text. Maybe because it's verboten, like Horror's saying. Maybe because Hollywood's got a fucking dyslexic racism problem and they really, really, really hate whites, Germans, and gingers. But they do not ever do the original book. Whenever they ever do a version, they always do a Disney-esque version. If not literally the version that was made simpler by Disney to transmogrify the text into a digestible context. Which is usually why they usually have a lot of boring goddamn writing to them. I have not seen a single story ever go out of their way to ever give fucking props or ever respect the German folklore as it was fucking writ by the Brothers Grimm. And there are so many cool-ass fucking monsters that come from it. Let me just show you. We're going to get back to the video in like 1 second, but I want to show you. Where's that wiki post? Ew, it's a fandom page. This will work though. Okay. So, Grimm is probably a basic breakdown of all of what you would need to know about the most interesting parts. Because ironically, there are comics and novels and the TV series, and apparently video games as well. But just in terms of the species, you've got multiple, okay? It has some shit to do with them being worshipped in the context of the story as being fucking gods and shit. And then you actually have breakdowns and characteristics that play on the concept. You've got a bunch of shit that demonstrates what they can seem like and what they can look like and how they behave. The complexities that can go into the genetics and how you can make hybrids and how many have been seen specifically mentioned by diary entries or storybook entries. And the show went out of their way to just demonstrate some of them as really good as you can get them. Let me bring up the filter for this, because you need to be able to see this properly. When I say they went out of their way to demonstrate, they really did go out of their way to demonstrate. Like, you got Alps, you got Anubises, I'm going to start butchering these. You've got Apanyeks, Asawongs, Arcadofuses, Balams, Barnabas, Ossifrogs, Barosquash, Blutbots. Every single type of fairy tale creature that you could reference from a book for the time that we're talking about, which is like, Buffy, I think, was off the air at this point. But we're talking the kind of makeup that you'd expect out of Angel, or the kind of writing you'd expect out of your soap opera dramas, because this was a cop procedural, ironically enough. Or out of, I was about to reference Lucifer. Lucifer also started as a cop procedural before it started moving to a drama-based serialized format. The amount of fairy tale creatures that I discovered have some type of crossover and reference through every single type of mythology. And even finding out that some of these concepts and these monster designs were just outright jacked and used in other places. I was so fucking annoyed. Because we were robbed. We were fucking robbed. You're telling me that you got shit in here that works in multiple contexts? You telling me that the idea of a white comes from a Hexenbeast or a Zauberbeist? That they're basically magic wizards and shit? And you got people that ain't putting in any of their goddamn effort to turn in what, granted, it was CGI in most cases, if it ever was practical in some cases, but you're telling me that they can turn in this and you didn't hire fucking Guillermo del Toro and that one guy who constantly does, like, character makeup bits and never appears as himself in a story? I'm forgetting the guy in question, but it's like, it's a really known, like, character actor. He basically only ever appears as, like, characters that he's mo-capping. He was the fish guy from Hellboy. You're telling me that you've got fucking fairy tales and stories and characters out there like this, and you're not turning in a German fucking novel or any series that could just take this and run with it? And it was on the CW! Mainline television? I can't believe it. We're sleeping on money! On money! So, like, the fact that people don't know shit about it. Pick up the phone. The way that they have slept on German mythology and they just do nothing with it whatsoever. David Greenwald, yeah, better explain why the goddamn shit works so well, because I just kept thinking of that green guy from fucking Angel. The way that they slept on German mythology really makes me think that it is an explicit choice to not... They don't know how to make money off this. Like, they have clearly decided to use this all the time, because at any time that they actually do end up referencing this, there is more effort put in by fucking DreamWorks whenever they happen to use the world of Shrek. Because Shrek's just all the fairy tales. Granted, they don't always use the Disney-esque versions of them. They explicitly go out of their way to actually punch up a lot of those stories. But, the amount of effort, NBC, not the CW, I might be confusing it with the CW because there's a lot of CW actors on it. Like, mainstay CW actors that just show up on it and a bunch of other projects, but pretty much the CW is the same as saying it's on cable. So, cable. Apologies. Or at least at some point it got picked up by the CW network, because I'm pretty sure I remember seeing it on the ownership rights, unless it's sometime converted. I want to check. No, it's on. It is on the CW network. I'm not a liar. I'm a truther. It might have been picked up. It might have been moved. It might have changed ownership and hands. But nah. CW. Reading wheat. Anyways, that's not important. Also, you can literally just watch it. Like, the playback that's currently there on the screen right here, these are all the episodes. They have them listed from seasons 1 through season 6. You can just watch them. The full episodes. On this website. It's probably the most based thing I had ever fucking seen. So you could catch up and learn about this shit for free if you want to. Anyways, my point. The fact that Hollywood sleeps on German storytelling, and the only time you ever do see fairy tales that come from unpopular mythologies is ironically as a joke, a throwaway joke even, in like a throwaway film like Hoodwinked, or in any of the Puss in Boot franchise pictures. But they tend to stick to nursery rhymes and shit, or shit. Shrek is really abysmal. Anyways, back to this.
It's also the shortest at barely 3 pages long, and we'll get to why that is later on. Little Briar Rose. Once upon a time, there was a king and queen who desperately wanted to have a child, when one day, during the queen's bath, a crab, or in the revised edition, a frog, creeps out of the water and proclaims that, in less than a year's time, she will soon have a daughter. And then she does. Overjoyed at the birth of his newborn child, the king decides to hold a celebration, but immediately runs into a problem. He wants to invite all 13 fairies in the kingdom to the celebration so that they'll favor her with gifts, but he only has 12 gold plates to serve them during dinner, so showing a considerable lack of foresight, he just doesn't invite one of them. On the day of the celebration, each fairy gives a gift like beauty and virtue to the child, but before the last fairy can give her gift, the 13th fairy shows up, furious at not being invited. So she declares that, in the child's 15th year, she will prick herself with a spindle and fall over dead, drops the mic, and then storms out as quickly as she came.
So all of us know that the fairy in question that they're talking about is Maleficent. And boy, do I have some fucking opinions about Maleficent. Honestly, I understand exactly why they went towards using Angelina Jolie, because she looks like she's a fucking mythical creature. The cheekbones, bro. But, for all of the wisdom of Disney, when they chose to make the Sleeping Beauty animations, they did try to at least reference in their animations the real-life movement of women that, when looked at upon further study, had some level of dramatic background and a decent understanding and sophistication to try to not so much sandblast and remove any touch of the German folklore, but more make the story seem timeless by not necessarily connecting it to a foreign root. So, like, in the smoothing of Sleeping Beauty, people probably don't care that Maleficent is a type of fairy or a type of fey creature. And instead, when they chose to then do that whole, the villains actually have a reason for being assholes, and basically Maleficent was a fairy that got raped by the king and he stole shit from her. This moment that they put into the fairy tale, there are different versions of this. And ironically, modern Disney did this shit fucking dirty. Because you see, I find it interesting, and I'm saying this because I want to know if she brings it up later. If she doesn't mention that Disney's choice to reimagine Maleficent's background was just, I was petty from not being invited to a party because you don't disinvite the Fae or disrespect them, or they're going to curse you and your bloodline for generations to come. They said, nah, rape that bitch, rape that bitch, rape her. And then she shows up and her desire to punish him mastitizes in the form of cursing what eventually becomes like a surrogate daughter to her because she loved the king. It'd be really funny if she doesn't bring this up later. It'd be really funny.
This comes as a shock to everyone, but the 12th fairy assures them that she can use her gift to counter it, so their daughter won't die. She'll just sleep for 100 years instead. Which I imagine her parents find to be quite a cold comfort, as the child they've been yearning for so long will live, but they'll just never get to see her awake or talk to her ever again. Wanting to avoid that terrible fate entirely, as an extra precaution, the king orders that all the spindles in the kingdom be destroyed. The princess grows to be a beautiful, witty, friendly, and well-mannered young woman without incident, until the day of her 15th birthday, when the king and queen just leave, with no explanation or reason given. Maybe it was the curse, maybe they were picking up cake. She explores the castle unsupervised for a while until she finds an old tower, and when she climbs to the top, the door is locked from the outside, with the key still in it. Not thinking any of this suspicious, she opens the door and finds an old woman there, spinning flax at a spindle. Now, due to the royal spindle ban, the princess has never seen anyone spin before, and is so intrigued that she wants to try her hand at it, and when she does, instantly pricks her finger and faints on the spot. At that very same moment, just as the king and queen return, every single living creature in the castle falls asleep as well, whereas outside, an impenetrable briar begins to surround the castle, until it grows so large it completely hides it from view. Eventually, a legend begins to spread of Briar Rose, a beautiful princess sleeping at the heart of a castle concealed by an immense briar patch. While many princes tried to reach her, they were all caught in the thorns, which seemed to act like strong hands possessed with the will to trap them, and unable to escape, they all died miserably. 100 years later, a traveling prince happens to be passing through when an old man tells him about the local legend of Briar Rose, and that his own grandfather told him of the many princes that had died in vain trying to reach her. However, this prince, rest in peace to you but I'm different, refuses to listen to reason and immediately sets off to rescue her. And apparently, he is different, because as soon as he gets close to the thorns, they bloom and make a path for him to enter, only to then close behind him. He makes his way through the castle, which is deathly quiet, passing by the peacefully sleeping inhabitants until finally he makes it to the tower and sees the princess laying asleep in bed. A bed that was omitted from the first edition, where she presumably just landed on the floor. Entranced by her beauty, he gives her a single kiss, and in that moment, she and the rest of the castle and all of the people and animals wake up, and as if they had just been frozen in time, continue what they were doing. The prince and princess get married and lived happily ever after. The end. This version is what I think of as the bare bones of the Sleeping Beauty.
My God. The idea that I had a week before about making an intro for the Ultimate Rape review, I cannot. Just horrors chat of great time! Brain rot! Brain rot! I have brain rot!
Beauty story. We have enough material to recognizably identify the story, but there are undeniable gaps, which I think the Grimm's brothers were at least partially aware of, hence the revisions they made in 1819. Some of these changes are innocuous, like the crab becoming a frog or the fairies being changed to wise women, but the late addition of the bed is quite telling. It's not a very romantic image to have the princess on the floor. She should be sleeping in a bed, so the question is, how did she get there? A bed being placed in the perfect position to catch her seems like a bit of a coincidence, even accounting for fairy tale logic. There's a gap in the story here, between the princess falling asleep and her ending up in the bed. And upon further examination, the Grimm's version is just riddled with holes like this. Why did the rest of the castle fall asleep? Where did the briars come from? Why did they attack all the other princes until the last one? Who was the old woman, and why was she locked in a tower spinning when there was a ban? Was she supposed to be the wicked fairy, or just an innocent bystander? The hardest thing to pinpoint in the Grimm's version is...
These are questions that inside of a different context just becomes, hey, you're nitpicking the story. Who are you to glaze over all these fairy tales?
Because it is so familiar, we have to be very careful about the invisible assumptions we bring with us into the story as a reader that aren't actually there. For my...
If you're reading a story and then you read another version of that story and you compare the two of them, you're going to have the ability to say, hey, actually, no, you're right. Why are these things like this? It's like if somebody were telling you about The Princess Bride, because The Princess Bride is actually an interesting case example of this. The Princess Bride, in novel form, is basically a grandfather telling a grandchild about a really long and boring story, but instead of telling him about all of the parts of the story, he's only telling them about the interesting parts. The way that the framing narrative works, being that because you're specifically telling them this grandiose story to keep a child interested. The same context exists here if the entire point of the fairy tale is just a good story. Because if the original version of the story is that it is a I really hate you preventative measure, where the moral of the story is don't disinvite the fae for your home, or according to Ace, don't invite any Fae and surround your kingdom in salt, people are gonna wonder, yeah, but how did she end up on a bed if she was just there in a tower, in a castle, where somehow nobody was paying attention to the princess whatsoever? Nobody had an attendant watching her, there was no butler to keep for her, the parents just simply decided to leave randomly. They would look at those and they would say plot hole. So, like, that's a fair question, but I don't know. Let's let her cook. Let's let her cook. She hasn't changed her writing style, I can tell you that much. She really hasn't. She really hasn't changed her writing style. It's the same shit she's did with anime. Anyways. The framing device of the Princess Bride book kind of drags, but the idea of the good stuff not being what the story was about for the author is hilarious. If I remember correctly, the book version is actually a version that is recapped from a synopsis that a progenitor of the character is trying to explain to the reader in the context that they are reading the version of the synopsis that has the boring parts cut out. Yes, I would agree that the framing device drags in book form, which is why it worked a lot better as a character device in the movie, because you can simply just interject with the grandfather character and the child character to move the plot along and skip through the parts that you don't want to make set pieces for. I digress.
To be the wicked fairy or just an innocent bystander? The hardest thing to pinpoint in the Grimm's version is, because it is so familiar, we have to be very careful.
Remember when Grimm came out at the same time during Once Upon a Time and Grimm was a way better show? Grimm was a way better show because it had heart. Once Upon a Time was used to capitalize off the fact that ABC is also owned by Disney, or working in partnership with Disney. During the time period, which I'm going to call the forgotten Netflix/cable crossovers for the Marvel franchise, they cared. I'm not fighting you because I agree with you. Get off my back. During the time of the ABC crossovers, ABC Family, which is now known as Freeform, and Netflix, these three cable and premium digital streaming services specialized in trying to harmonize cable properties and premium cable properties into a single multi-streaming narrative. So, with ABC, you had Agent Carter, Once Upon a Time, and Once Upon a Time in Wonderland, and Once Upon a Time in Agrabah, I guess, and the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. show, which meant Marvel, Inhumans, a little bit of X-Men, a little bit of Marvel Knights, and pretty much anything that the writers could throw at the wall. And they had to work in the context of procedural narratives and what's going to happen next, tune in next time, cliffhanger, serialized dramas. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. was pretty much a viewpoint of, okay, you have no context to what's happening inside of organizations like S.H.I.E.L.D., so we're going to give you a look into what's going on. Once Upon a Time was, because we have Disney money, we're going to throw Disney money and a little bit of fucking writing, soap opera, what the fuck is going on here, writing, at the wall and see what sticks. Because, hey, we have Jennifer Morrison. And this person who some of you have never recognized. And her face and their titties in these dresses make your brain go awooga. And then they had the Defenders line and brand. Jessica Jones, Luke Cage, Daredevil, and Iron Fist. And then eventually the Defenders, to bring in street-level heroes, to give you a viewpoint of what street-level characters in the MCU, because it wasn't officially canonized until literally recently, with the return of Daredevil Born Again, that the Netflix characters were and are a part of the Sacred Timeline. as per the ending and writing of Loki Season 1 and Season 2. Assuming that they do make good on the supposed rumors of a return of Jonathan Majors to clean up Kang's character in lieu of whatever fucking timeline or whatever writing trope they're going to use next. And then, on Freeform, you have The Runaways, which was an in-between story that had X-Men and mutants and Marvel Knight characters and the equivalent of, I guess, the even bigger, darker imprint that had to do with Marvel Knights, because they involved characters like Nico, which apparently now she's just showing up in your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man for reasons that have no fucking logic unto whatever they thought was smart. With people that are writers directly associated with the people that are writing The Witcher, because they're friends of and colleagues of Lauren S. Hissrich and women like her, to take a teenage YA adapted story of kids who are the children of supervillains to discover how to use their abilities and powers to fight against the agenda of their parents, and also learn how to work like a superhero team / family, and all the interpersonal romance dramas between themselves and others. They didn't go in the direction that main modern retelling of fairy tales for Disney did. You know, when they started bastardizing all of their old animateds by making them into live action 3Ds, because they only needed to just give you a viewpoint of something that you otherwise would not have seen. So for Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., watching on the network was more important because this was something that didn't necessitate that stupid talking point that you need to watch every single fucking thing. Disney Descendants is not the same. Disney Descendants is not the same. Hold your tongue. They focused on trying to give you a viewpoint of what's happening inside of S.H.I.E.L.D. So, alongside the development of the MCU, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. acts as a lens inside the organizations that allow the Avengers, S.H.I.E.L.D., the S.H.I.E.L.D. corrupted Hydra, and then the remnants of S.H.I.E.L.D. turning into Sword or Saber, or whatever the fuck they're going to call them for the MCU, into the organization that they've developed into now. So you can have the ability for them to be involved, and when, you know, the second Captain America film came out, you now see the after effects of discovering that S.H.I.E.L.D. has been infiltrated by Hydra. And then with characters like Hive, or bringing characters like, I forget what the one, it's not the Robbie Reyes Ghost Rider, because they brought in a different character that had a similar ability to him as a test to see if they could do Ghost Rider, and then they did Ghost Rider in Season 3 alongside the Hive storyline for, I'm forgetting that character's name. I don't think it's Adam. It's Eric. The fucking straight-laced white guy who gets left on the moon and then killed by Hive and then gets used by him, while they go the direction of using the female lead character. I love Mediacom so much. What a great fucking service. What a cotton picking native motherfucker and a goddamn fire on the goddamn roadway with some fucking tire irons, and I will make sure your family watches. Anyways, as I was saying, where you could be able to tell the story of what's happening inside of S.H.I.E.L.D. and other agencies associated with them, you then had the not Descendants. Now you put that shit in my head. We're going to talk about that in a hot second after I'm done. You could then port over into premium / streaming service cable and then watch the street level heroes in the MCU doing their thing on their separate shows that not only act as the introduction of their character and their backstory, because in the case of a character such as Christine Ritter coming off of the Don't Trust the Bee in Apartment 23, with James Vanderbeek, she would then go and do the character of Jewel, who, if they choose to go with the timeline where they do not have Luke Cage making coffee with the night nurse, because this is where Disney would take Rosario Dawson, take her from the street level series, and just throw her at fucking Star Wars and make her Ahsoka. You then have the ability to view into the world building and the grandiose writing thereof, with the world designed after the introduction of Charlie Cox's Daredevil. And all of the shit that they had to do with Hogan and with Foggy. Is his name Foggy or is it Foggy? Anyways, his business partner, and then Deborah Ann Wool's character as his love interest / secretary. Foggy, it is Foggy. And his secretary desk character, so that Deborah Ann Wool can finally stop doing fucking tabletop RPG shit. Because they needed to have street-level heroes that could react to the world-ending threats that the Avengers were dealing with. Which, they took this concept and then put them into Disney Plus to do that, and they did it shitty. And then, you still had, Once Upon a Time, to take the franchises that they now have the ability to make a modern retelling of, and basically, by the time you got to Season 3, where they decided to do the fucking Winter Queen with Elsa and Anya, it was literally Disney-approved soap opera drama with extra steps. Some of them were good. Some of them in the beginning were really good. But eventually, when they got tired and done with the Dark One storyline, and they decided to age up the child character and try to make the story about him, and then they started getting complex with the timelines and the events and wishes and magic spells, they pretty much went the way that all serialized dramas did, which is that they started making them really fucking garbage. Not to mention the outright fucking flubs that they did in Disney Plus. Now, let's talk about Descendants. Descendants is not the same. Descendants is triple threats trying to launch their career in a way to make a franchise that can eventually then be made into an animated cartoon. That is them going the way of Monster High. That's what Descendants was. It was just, hey, we've got people like these stars that are on our sitcoms, like Lab Rats and Ant Farm and fucking Jessie. We should do something with these baby faces that are growing up in the industry, and we should give them something to do. That's what Descendants was. It was a Dove Cameron engine. And all the other actors around them. That is entirely different, because at the very minimal base, they at least did their job by bringing in people that were trying to be something new. Because they weren't trying to retell the fairy tales. What they were doing is that they were making a new generation of villain characters. And it was a separate canon that has nothing to do and would never affect the original works. Maybe it would change the context in which you imagine them, because, hey, who's going to imagine that someone's knocking up Cruella de Vil? Hey, who's going to imagine that somebody other than this king from this fairy tale is knocking up fucking, Maleficent? And so on, and so on, and so on. For every single villain that exists in the story, there is basically a child character that they are the parent of. That's what Descendants was. It is entirely different from that. Anyways, this entire idea of deciding to set up these different lenses to give you a viewpoint into the cinematic universes that they were involved for, and the spin-offs therein, are directly responsible for how they would then insert certain actors. Because Sebastian Shaw, our Bucky Barnes, he was a fucking escapee from Once Upon a Time. He was the Mad Hatter. And he left because he couldn't do this show and also be in the movies at the same time. But anyways.
Careful about the invisible assumptions we bring with us into the story as a reader that aren't actually there. For my part, I started to notice that my mind would automatically try to smooth over these gaps. I thought maybe the reason her parents left was that they were overconfident that they had solved the problem by destroying all the spindles. But that's not in the text. My brain just applied a hypothetical explanation to make the story flow better. And the
I don't think they wasted Sebastian Shaw's potential. I think he actually made a better place for himself being Bucky. I think him being on Once Upon a Time actually prepared him for the kind of fucking ass dialogue that he'd have to work around and work with. And honestly, he is not the worst person. And he's not the worst actor when it comes to people who are involved with the the side characters that eventually become main characters in their own right in the canonized backlog of Captain America. Because he's probably one of the best actors for him in that way, and the way in which they are writing him is going to inform how they put him in the comics, and it also informed how he showed up in other media. Because ironically enough, this very concept is the reason why people are in love with Marvel Rivals. Because instead of going the soy direction, they went the base direction, but less about China. Different stream. Different stream. Lock in.
Smoothing over can work both ways. I think most readers would assume that the kiss is supposed to be on the mouth, but since the text doesn't explicitly specify where, and kissing sleeping women hits a bit different in the modern era, as the illustrator, I used a bit of creative liberty to draw that kiss on the forehead. By combing over the wording of the text while actively keeping our assumptions in check, can we better help identify these gaps and why they might have ended up there. For instance, nowhere in the text is it mentioned that the spindle is being used in tandem with the spinning wheel. It only mentions the spindle itself, meaning that she was probably hand spinning using a drop spindle. So, could this mean that the story has roots that predate the invention of the spinning wheel? If so, that would make it very old, as we have illustrations of spinning wheels from as far back as the 1200s, but we found the remains of whirl-weighted spindles that are, at the very least, Neolithic if not older. Also, if you're looking at the spindle and wondering what she was supposed to have pricked herself on, don't worry, we'll get to that. But what I think is the most interesting is that the good fairy makes no mention of true love's kiss as being a requirement to wake the princess, which almost makes it seem like it's not the arrival of the prince that wakes her up, it's the time limit of 100 years being met. And if that's the case, then all those other princes threw themselves into their deaths for nothing. The only reason the last one didn't get pricked to death was just because he showed up at the right time, which will make the prince in this version completely incidental. It's an unlikely theory given the timing, but the role of the prince is something we should probably keep an eye on when we examine the earlier variants.
You know, other than the fact that it's a fucking fairy tale, and whenever you have a princess, you usually have a prince, because that's just how we do things out here. You know. Hey, what's that? Oh, I'm making a reference to anime? It's exactly the same, right? No, you stupid fucking bent. They're literally reincarnated lovers! This is not even comparable, you asshat! Rein it in, Carl. Rein it in. Rein it in. We have yet even begun to spurg. I'm breaking out the fucking notes. Okay. 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 1 second. I need to update my thing. You've only started to watch Sailor Moon. What I said is not too big of a spoil in context of like the original constantly ongoing versions. If you're watching Sailor Moon by watching Sailor Moon Crystal, they're gonna streamline and abridge a lot of shit. Some of these details you don't learn until Super S. And definitely do not watch the dubs. Watch the subs. Watch the original Japanese. But update faster, you fuck. But yeah, you can't compare this to that. You can't compare it. You can't compare. It cannot be compared. Not even close can it be fucking compared. Anyways. Okay. Scholar Draw is updated. One too many. Okay.
Those other princes threw themselves into their deaths for nothing. The only reason the last one didn't get pricked to death was just because he showed up at the right time.
Okay, so problem with the story is that we are dealing with a fairy tale. So, because we are dealing with a fairy tale, the prince is meant to represent not necessarily true love's kiss, but is meant to represent love and or change showing up at the right time in real life. Because every fairy tale is inspired by a foible. And the point of a foible, or just fable, is that it is meant to be a lesson, something to help the people of the time explain to young children the moral of the story. Technically, the moral of Sleeping Beauty is that you have to wait for good things to come. But realistically, if you're going to say that the difference of the story is not impacted by choosing to compare the prince to fucking Sailor Moon, I can draw better than that. That you're going to compare the prince to fucking Sailor Moon, of all things.
Which would make the prince in this version completely incidental. It's an unlikely theory given the timing, but the role of the prince is something we should probably keep an eye on when we examine the early...
You are implying... Damn it. You are implying that Sailor Moon is somehow diegetically even comparable to the fantasy novel. And my problem with this, because I actually watch way too much anime, to the point that one of my versions of me for thumbnails is literally Usagi's friend, the one with the Coke bottle glasses, is that the amount of backstory that exists between them is relevant. Get this out of my way. I have to click this one. I'm dumb. They're not comparable. 1-to-1, they're not comparable. First off, foremost. Bitch, the fuck is wrong with you? You watch way too many girl-related animes for you to ever make that goddamn take. What the fuck would make you think that you should even reference Sailor Moon in any close reference to that whatsoever? Every single thing that happens with Sailor Moon is a cycle. Unlike the fairy tale. But, moving forward.
Earlier variants. Anyway, the Brothers Grimm didn't claim to invent these stories. They collected and compiled them from other sources and then fit them into a shared, distinctly German identity, even if they were definitely not German in origin. And their source for Little Briar Rose comes from Marie Hassenflug, and her version was almost certainly based off the French version by Charles Perrault, because much of it is as identical as a story can be after being filtered and translated into another language.
Just like Beauty and the Beast. But we don't talk about that one now, do we?
In 1697, Charles Perrault published Tales from Pastimes with Morals, or Mother Goose Tales, a collection of 8 fairy tales which included Sleeping Beauty, Little Red Riding Hood, Bluebeard, The Master Cat or Puss in Boots, Diamonds and Toads, Cinderella, Riquet with a Tuft, and Hop o' My Thumb, and each one had an explicit moral tacked on at the end. Again, these stories existed before Perrault, with perhaps the exception of Hop o' My Thumb, which appears to not have any known older counterpart, and maybe Bluebeard, though I doubt that, we'll get to it. But he changed and added and shaped them into a form that we now recognize as familiar to this very day. Perrault... Oh, where do I begin with Perrault? So, the Grimm's brothers' decision to start compiling a collection of folktales was partially an academic attempt to preserve these oral traditions from fading into obscurity, sure, but it was also in large part due to the rise of romantic nationalism in the early 19th century. They wanted to establish these tales as a point of pride, of a shared, distinctly historic German identity.
Which people are allowed to have, and if you say that people are not allowed to have pride in their cultures, we're going to have a very serious conversation on what white is.
Though they included and adapted several of the distinctly French versions by Perrault. And Perrault also had, shall we say, ulterior motives. So, in England and France during the 17th century, there was something called the Quarrel of the Ancients and the Moderns, and it was something of an academic debate at the time. The people on the ancient side valued the era of classical Greek and Roman antiquity as a source of great masterpieces and knowledge that had been rediscovered around the 15th century, and should be studied, recorded, preserved, and valued in order to also learn how to create great works that would last the test of time. From their perspective, the Renaissance was a golden age of enlightenment, the foundation that all current great works are built upon, and its greatness could never be rivaled. And on the other side, Perrault was the leader of the modern faction who thought that was stupid and that 17th century French works were superior to literally anything that had ever come before because they paid glory to the king and church. Unlike,
You know, French pride, and if you tell me that there is no such thing as French pride, I'm gonna hit you with a baguette through the internet.
those nasty, dumb, barbaric pagans that couldn't hold a candle to the civilized 17th century French authors. Like, I agree in theory.
French, and I cannot explicitly say this hard enough, superiority is the basis of why we insult people by saying they have egos, by saying they're Napoleon. What the fuck do you think most French people are concerned with, girl? We're talking about the countries that are responsible for the backgrounds behind our schools of thought. Please, explain your point on this one.
Unlike those nasty, dumb, barbaric pagans that couldn't hold a candle to the civilized 17th century French authors. Like, I agree in theory, but on principle, I think this says more about Perrault's ego than anything else. And this
Frenchmen, we have big egos. Big egos. Very big egos.
is, frankly, hilarious, considering that Perrault seems to be one of the only members of the modern faction whose works widely outlived him, especially since his most well-known works are retellings of fairy tales, with roots that run at least as far back as classical Greece and Rome. Anyway, point is, my dude wasn't trying to preserve these stories as an academic scholar. He embraced adaptation to create a more compelling story, and to his credit, clearly succeeded, as his versions have withstood the passage of time to the modern day. However, Perrault was a wealthy member of the bourgeoisie, and he published these tales for an aristocratic audience, which was considered to be, at the time, a trendy form of entertainment. And to say that this informed his narrative and moral lens is a bit of an understatement. For instance, his version of Little Red Riding Hood.
This man, he didn't do this for altruistic reasons. He did this because he was trying to best the bitches at court. Once again, Frenchmen. French aristocrats. And pray tell, Morality, what did we do with our French pride to French aristocrats? Great American fruit slicer.
Served as a cautionary tale about stranger danger to contemporary courtly women, warning them not to be tricked into getting into bed with a strange man, no matter how charming and kind he may seem. Whereas in his version of Bluebeard, a story about a wealthy nobleman whose last 6 wives mysteriously all vanished without a trace, and has recently gotten remarried to his 7th wife, and
otherwise known as the online journeys of Jean-Francois Guerapy. It's historic, JF.
he's about to leave on a trip, but before he does, he tells his new wife to never, ever, under any circumstances, look in the basement, before promptly handing her the keys and booking it. And when she inevitably does take a quick peek, she finds the very murdered bodies of Bluebeard's previous wives. Once he comes back, he realizes what she's done and is about to murder her too, but he's stopped at the last minute and killed by her brothers. And the moral of this one is, essentially, curiosity killed the cat, so obey your husband no matter what. Like, buddy, I got a feeling the wife wasn't the problem in that story.
There's that classical moralities. I'm gonna say slurs! Okay, so Noralities has a certain fucking quality of her, guys. She has a quality where she will find a way to stick modern politics into her talking points. Yes, we definitely needed to pivot to explain how, haha, stupid men, you see how they are always trying to control women and tell them that they need to be subjective slaves? Classical moralities! But see, now I have a mute button, so now I don't have to rape everybody's fucking ears. Oh no, Saffronet, I didn't just make a video, I made videos. Cause this is that goddamn essayist revisionist history I fucking hate. Turn the gain down, Carl. This is that fucking revisionist history bullshit I fucking hate with a goddamn passion. You hate men so goddamn much that you gotta fucking stop your video about a topic to complain about how you hate that men control women in history. Or have controlled women. Or would control women again. You can only take so much before you fucking snap, okay? You can only take so much before you fucking snap. Neuralities is the reason why I take notes. Because if you don't take notes on her and just look at what she chooses to compare and contrast versus what the assignment is and what she did for extra credits, you'll come away from these videos thinking, did I just get scammed? And yes, you are! We are being scammed. Okay. Yes, neuralities, I can agree. Having a story that basically amounts to, yeah, your husband is an evil person and you should be happy that you had brothers capable of defending you from him because you didn't listen to him when he told you not to look in the fucking basement. That's so cool. It's so grand. I know, you hate a noble Frenchman because he would dare write stories for people to entertain them at court. But what the fuck does that gotta do with fucking Snow White? Talking through it.
Perrault seems to have a bit of a blind spot when it comes to the noble classes. Sure, the man you meet.
Oh, you mean do you mean the country whose words are liberty, freedom, and fraternity? Fraternity, meaning men. Men, imperialistic men beating their wives, men, literally patriarchy. Damn, that's crazy. That's so weird. That's so weird, Neuralities.
On the street is a dangerous predator that will eat you alive, but the man in your home of good breeding doing the same should be obeyed, even if he's just as dangerous as the wolf. This brings us to Perrault's version of Sleeping Beauty, which is heavily embellished and a good 4 times longer than the Grimm's version. You'll see why in just a moment. The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood. The story starts with a king and queen who desperately want to have a child. They've tried everything with no luck so far, until one day, something must have worked because the queen finally has a daughter. The king holds a grand celebration and invites all 7 fairies in the kingdom to attend as her godmothers, so that they might each favor the princess with a gift. There's a grand feast, and the banquet table is laid out with a custom gold serving dish with a lid and tableware for each fairy, made in advance just for this extra special occasion. When all of a sudden, quite unexpectedly, another fairy arrives uninvited, simply because she hadn't left her tower for the last 50 years, and everyone assumed she was either dead or enchanted, so the king didn't think to invite her like the rest. In a panic, he orders a place to be made for her, but she's the only one with a conspicuously non-gold setting, since everyone else's was a pre-order exclusive. This slights the old fairy, who starts muttering vague threats under her breath, which another fairy overhears and, reading the room, decides to hide. She knows that she can't prevent whatever is about to happen, but readies herself for damage control duty afterwards. Each fairy gives the child a gift of beauty, wit, grace, and so on until it's the old fairy's turn, whereupon she declares that the princess will be pierced by a spindle and die of the wound. Everyone is distraught until the last fairy reveals herself and uses her gift so that the princess won't die, but fall into a sleep which shall last 100 years, at the end of which a king's son shall come and wake her. The next part plays out the same as the Grimm's version. The king bans all spindles, 15 or 16 years later, the king and queen leave, the princess climbs up the tower and finds an old woman there spinning. Although, somewhat confusingly, this version clarifies that the old woman didn't know about the spindle ban, or recognize the princess either, which frankly just raises more questions considering that she's in the castle, but whatever. The princess asks to try spinning, and whether it was due to being too hasty or fairy magic or maybe both, immediately pricks herself and collapses on the spot. The old woman calls out for help, and the castle staff try several methods to wake her, throwing water in her face, unlacing her bodice, striking her palms, rubbing her temples with perfume, but nothing works. When the king arrives, he realizes the inevitable must have happened and puts his daughter to bed and commands that she should be unbothered until she awakes. The good fairy soon hears the news and arrives at the castle an hour later in a fiery chariot drawn by dragons. The fairy realizes that if the princess wakes up 100 years from now, alone with everyone she's ever known long dead, she'll probably be a little upset, and decides to curse the rest of the castle staff, inflicting that same terrible fate upon them, displacing them out of time so that when the princess wakes up, she'll have servants to wait on her. And then after all that, she doesn't put the king or the queen to sleep. Wasn't the opening about how badly they wanted a daughter? Anyway, the king and queen abandon the castle, forbid anyone to go near it, and the fairy surrounds the castle in bramble to protect the princess as she sleeps. 100 years later, a prince is out hunting in the woods when by chance he lays sight on a castle tower peeking out from the thorns, and intrigued, decides to ask some locals about it.
The truth of what's in the overgrown castle has drifted over time, so no one knows for certain what's going on in there, but everyone agrees that it's probably haunted by ghosts or witches or ogres. Everyone, except for one man, who remembers that his father and grandfather said that there was a princess in there, sleeping for a century, waiting for a prince to come wake her. Deciding that he must be that very prince, he runs off to test his luck. The brambles part, and then close behind him, he wanders through the castle, finds the princess, kneels beside her, just as the enchantment expires, and she wakes up, they fall in love, and get married, and live happily ever after, except that they don't, because there's a full B plot after this. The morning after, the prince returns home by himself, and when his father asks why he didn't come home last night, he makes up a story about getting lost and staying in a peasant cottage overnight. The king believes him, but his mother doesn't buy it, and after the third time he claims to have been out all night hunting, she's pretty sure that he's sneaking off to meet a lover in secret. The queen keeps questioning him, but he never tells her the truth because, although he loves his mother, she comes from a line of ogres, whom the king would have never married if not for her vast and enormous wealth. It had even been rumored that the queen had an ogre's taste for human flesh, and had been seen gazing hungrily at nearby children on more than one occasion. So yeah, the prince doesn't tell her, and keeps up the ruse for the next 2 years, while in the meantime, the princess has a daughter named Dawn, and then a son called Day, because he was a great deal more handsomer and more beautiful than his sister. 2 more years later, the old king dies, and our prince is crowned as the new king, at which point he's forced to publicly announce his marriage, and brings his wife and children to live in the palace with him. Soon after, he starts a war with a neighboring country, and leaves both the affairs of the kingdom and the well-being of his wife and children in the hands of his mother. An objectively terrible and short-sighted decision.
This is just the plot of a goddamn anime, if we're being serious. Which is probably the reason why she got interested and wanted to make this video. I'm in love with the fact that I have a mute button now. Let's play a game, chat. Lip read the insults I'm saying as I'm upset.
Because as soon as he's gone, the old queen sends his wife away to live in a woodland manor, and asks for the kitchen clerk to prepare the daughter Dawn for her dinner tomorrow. Horrified, but knowing he has very little choice in the matter, the cook makes a half-hearted attempt, but just can't bring himself to go through with it. Instead, he hides the child with his wife in the servants' quarters and feeds the queen some lamb instead. The same routine happens with Day and then their mother. They're kept safe for a time until the old queen takes a walk through the courtyard and happens to overhear the family squabbling. Realizing she'd been tricked, the next morning she orders a public execution of not only the mother and her children, but also their accomplices, the kitchen clerk, his wife, and their maid, to be carried out by throwing them into a tub of toads and vipers in the castle courtyard. But just then, the king arrives home early, demands to know what the hell is going on, and before anyone can even say anything, the old queen in a rage throws herself into the tub and is eaten alive. Which bums the king out a little because, after all, she was his mom, but he gets over it pretty quickly because he still has his beautiful, 100% human wife and children. And the story ends with the moral that patience is a virtue, and good things come to those who wait, especially for young maidens looking for love. Yeah, I don't know about that moral, Perot. When compared to each other.
You see what I'm talking about? You have to let it wash over you like a wave. And then afterwards, you get to the end and it's like, what the fuck did I just hear? Anyways.
They're like this, it becomes pretty clear that the Grimm's version is more or less an abridged copy of Perrault's. The core story is almost identical, but Perrault provides more information and answers almost all of the questions that were raised in the Grimm.
Oh, what's going on? The explanation of why Neuralities makes her content the way that she makes it. And also, I was saying slurs when I muted my microphone like this. So now, it is my belief that she wanted to make this video specifically to complain about the differences in stories. Because I guess she really, really hates Frenchmen. Unfortunate. I wonder who traumatized her like that. Anyways.
Grimm's version. So what probably happened here is that Marie Hassenflug, who is credited as the source for several Grimm's fairy tales, including Little Red Riding Hood, and notably was fluent in French, probably became familiar with Perrault's version at one point or another, and when asked, recounted it to the Grimm's brothers from memory. This would explain why the key plot points were set up the same, but some of the specifics were lost, and you get the weird solutions that aren't set up properly, like the princess laying in a bed without ever being put there. For instance, the Wicked Fairy doesn't specify when the princess will prick her finger, meaning it could happen at any time in her future, unlike in the Grimm's version, which clearly dates it to her 15th birthday, meaning the completely avoidable mistake of leaving your daughter alone on the day that you know she's supposed to be cursed is a Grimm original plot hole. Marie knew that the princess pricked herself when she turned 15, so that information got co-opted into the mechanics of the curse, which was a change significant enough to accidentally form a plot hole. And that is fascinating. This is a huge pitfall that anyone trying to retell or even adapt a pre-existing work into another medium has to be aware of, and it's not as easy to avoid as you might first think.
No, it's the consequences of oral tradition. But part of oral tradition is that you have people who are designated to be the storyteller, and they tell the story as they heard it from the person they heard it from, directly from relative to bloodline relative, usually with some type of physical written record that it's interpreted from. What happened here was a person from one culture then told it to a person of another culture and did the equivalent of the Princess Bride, where they skipped through pieces and parts that they thought would bore the person they were talking to. In other words, the thing that happens when men talk to women and women talk to men. She structured the parts necessary from memory based on the things that were important here, and then when it was being retold, they, as they heard it, tried to take and extrapolate from the information and then put that to page. And what they heard in that game of telephone became the writing parts. This could happen at any time based on whether or not a person wants to bastardize the work, like normal people do, and editors do, and DIIers do, or someone knows a version of it, and then in trying to make it more palatable to kids, instead of Ariel turning into Seafoam at the end of the story, we live happily ever after and be married and end up having a child who goes through the exact same shit as her mother, thus creating book endings. It's a normal convention that happens all the time inside of literary works and inside of the literary field. It is not something that is so hard that you need to have such a specific need to tear down on. It could be for as simple as there was a smudge on the page, and it can be as complex as an actual conspiracy to try and dumb down the story so that even babies can understand it. But then losing the spirit of the message because you dumbed it down to where babies can understand it.
Even seemingly minor changes can have these huge ripple effects in a story because you never know.
In other words, the moral of the story is you don't hate localizers enough.
Which piece of a story is or isn't narratively load-bearing until after you change it. We think of these stories as concrete, but that's only because they're constantly being refined with every retelling, intentionally or otherwise. Like, as far as I can tell, the old woman being the wicked fairy in disguise is actually a later addition from the ballet by Tchaikovsky in 1889. It's not from any earlier version, but it makes sense. It's a strong narrative choice, and so it's persisted into modern retellings. And while I can't say for sure, the ballet might also be where we started to call it a curse, too. The Grimm's version doesn't describe the 100 years sleep as a curse. It's referred to as fairy magic, but Perrault goes a step further and instead calls it a fairy prophecy. The good fairy prophesies that the sleep will last 100 years in total, and at the end of it, a prince will come and wake her. Perrault includes the prince as part of the prophecy even though he only kneels beside her, meaning the kiss that wakes the princess is also a Grimm original edition. So which is it? What actually breaks the spell? Is it the 100 years or is it the arrival of the prince? The Grimm's version had a ton of other princes before the 100 years that apparently weren't good enough, effectively turning the Briars into a secret test of character, weeding out the inferior princes and only opening for the right one at the right time. But in the Perrault version, there's just one prince, and he literally doesn't do anything. He just shows up, he doesn't even kiss her. I think both the Grimm's and Perrault's versions are ambiguous enough that you can interpret it either way depending on your preference.
Yes, because that's the point of narratives and morals and coming to the consequence of the story. Because, and I don't think she'll call this out, there's a timeline where the choice of having a person show up there is that actually this is a secret conspiracy done by the Fae as a way to punish the humans for the consequence of forgetting about them. Basically reminding them that not only do good things come to those who wait, but also revenge is a dish best served cold after bitter spurning. Which in itself would be cruel as shit, because when you consider how many actual fairies are responsible for trying to salvage things, I believe the Disney version has just the 3 Technicolored witches, the ones that grow size. When you bring in the inclusion of the woodland creatures and other mythical creatures alongside those fairies, as well as Maleficent, what you end up dealing with is that if we want to go by German Fae culture, all of the Fae would have considered it a disrespect. So they would have had a person that basically says, no, it's fairy magic. There's nothing I can do. When actually, they literally could just dispel it right then and there. But they choose not to because they consider it her right to justify having been annoyed. and there was one fae that felt differently about it, that wanted to be merciful onto an innocent that had not disrespected the forest. Because they're literally a fucking child. They don't have agency. We're French people. We don't think about nature like that. But you know who do? The Germans. This will probably not be brought up. I just want to point that out there. Because whatever you walk away with the interpretation for, it's whatever was in the mind of the author when they wanted to foretell what they were doing. So, you're really just spinning on a wheel, and we're just guessing, and it doesn't matter. So, like, who cares? Other than you. And I guess also me, because we're talking about it. Whatever, moving forward.
But the strangest addition in Perrault's version is that B-plot. It's weird, right? Most modern retellings of Sleeping Beauty stop after the big kiss, and that's because the rest kind of comes out of nowhere and doesn't seem to have anything to do with the first half of the story. The fairies never show up again, the 100-year time skip has no impact on anything, Sleeping Beauty lives in secret for 4 years before the prince's part-ogre mother tries to eat her and her children. The princess could be swapped out for any fairy tale princess and nothing would change. Also, if his mom is part ogre, shouldn't the prince be like a quarter ogre and his children like an eighth? It's baffling that someone like Perrault, who seems to care so much about the purity of noble bloodlines, was just fine with his male lead being part monster. I mean, it's almost like Perrault just made a wild character change to the villain without thinking about the narrative consequences that would create.
There it is. There it is. There it is. There's that I fucking hate. They're old men in the past, Nora. They're not gonna prognosticate that in the future a fucking twee radfem is going to desperately try to find ways to slander every single instance of people behaving in culture, and then an African-American man that he would have called a troglodyte to his face comes to remind you that you're out of your fucking depth. But you know what? That's just me, though.
Yeah, so let's get to our third sleeping princess.
Actually, that goes on the document.
Character change to the villain without thinking about the narrative consequences that would create. Yeah, so let's get to our third sleeping princess. Giambattista Basile was an Italian poet born in 1566 and is best known for his work Pentamerone, which was published in 1634, only 2 years after his death, by his sister Adriana. Pentamerone is a collection of 50 fairy tales relayed diegetically in the larger narrative by 10 female storytellers over the course of 5 days, meaning it's a collection of stories being told in-universe within the main story. Pentamerone is acclaimed as being one of, if not the oldest known, written European accounts of some of these stories, including possibly the oldest known version of Rapunzel, and also maybe Snow White. But while the average reader could probably pick out at least a few story beats as familiar, if not the actual names that they're told under, by this point they're in a pretty different shape from their modern counterparts. And I mean like, upsettingly different. Basile ended each story with a moral attached to it, and they are a stark reminder that human values on morality vary wildly depending on the time period, culture, context, and location. A hero in one story can easily be viewed as a villain with enough time and distance. In Basile's version of Cinderella, she fully murders her first stepmother. She drops a chest lid on her to break her neck on purpose so that her father can get remarried to someone else. And that's like a mild example. These are not nice stories. We are firmly in the not safe for kids section of old fairy tales. And as
Yeah, because fairy tales were not meant to fucking be nice little reminders to put kids to bed. They were meant to terrify them to do what the fuck they were supposed to learn to survive in the circumstances they lived in. You're a person who has lived a soft life that hasn't had to deal with the realities of the hardships that fucking comes with. So for you, ooh, that's a bit icky. They don't give a shit. They were having kids at 13 and dying before 25.
As a warning, there are going to be some unavoidable adult themes in basically all of the rest of these. So
You're grown adults. If you can't handle being able to talk about grown adult subject matters and constantly warning people about the subject matter of something that they clicked onto the video of, well, this is just your audience, so they have to be told. Norisms.
So please proceed with caution. Like, we're here to have fun.
You feel like you're losing your mind? There you go, Caramel. There you go. Now you're just like little babyface Carl at the beginning of understanding his own writing methods. Makes you want to punch the screen, don't it? Makes you want to punch the screen, don't it?
But this one is a bit of a yikes.
Ooh. Stories are a bit of a yikers. Ooh. It's gonna feel a little bit disgusting. Ooh. Talking about hard subjects is kind of hard and icky. Ooh.
Sun, Moon, and Talia. Our story begins with a great lord naming his newborn daughter Talia when he calls for several.
Also, if this has nothing to do with Sleeping Beauty as a story tale, this is literally just you now going way further beyond the point of what you wanted to make a video for. So you could antagonize your audience with safe for work, preparatory, disgusting conversations. Not telling you you can't have the conversations. But this is what we call feature creep.
Several wise men and astrologers to calculate her birth chart based on the position of the stars and therefore divine her future. Eventually, after working it all out, they conclude that Talia is going to be in grave danger from a splinter of flax, and with a considerable amount of foresight, her father simply forbids any flax, hemp, or similar materials be brought into his house to avoid the danger altogether. Talia grows up into a fine young lady without issue, when one day, while gazing out from her window, she spies an old woman passing by, who happens to be spinning. And because of the flax ban, Talia has never seen a distaff or spindle before, and is so curious to know how it works, she invites the old woman in so that she can have a try. She borrows the distaff and tries to begin to stretch the flax, but never having done it before, her inexperience causes a splinter to run under her nail and she drops dead on the spot. The old woman panics and runs away, and according to the narrator in one version, is still running even now. Once her father hears of this, he lays her to rest in one of his country mansions, locks the doors, and totally bereft with grief and just wanting to forget his loss, abandons it. A non-specific amount of time later, a king is out hunting when one of his falcons flies into an open window of the mansion. He knocks first, asking to be let in, and when nobody answers, assumes it must be abandoned, and he climbs in looking for his bird. He looks everywhere, but doesn't find anyone. That is, until he stumbles upon Talia, who, thinking she's just asleep, and is, well, so enchanted by her beauty that he sleeps with her, and afterwards leaves to go back to his...
A whole fucking frame.
Who, thinking she's just asleep, and is, well, so enchanted by her beauty that he sleeps with her, and afterwards leaves to go back to his kingdom and completely forgets about the whole thing. 9 months later...
How do you spell it? W-H-U. Oh, hey, there we go. Nora, we live in current year. Putting your moralities into your work to censure and shame people who are dead and can't hear us is not going to undo the story that you're talking about, but it is going to eliminate you from being able to talk seriously about the subject matter in which you are trying to make work for. We can't take you seriously if you apply your modern moralities to old works. They can't hear you call them chud.
Talia gives birth that he sleeps with her, and afterwards leaves to go back to his kingdom and completely forgets about the whole thing. 9 months later, Talia gives birth to twins, a boy and a girl, Sun and Moon, respectively. While attempting to nurse, one of them sucks on Talia's finger, removing the splinter of flax, which causes her to wake up, alone and confused with 2 newborns. Eventually, the king remembers Talia exists and returns to find her awake, and when he explains what happened, everyone is super happy and into it, and the king promises to take her back to his kingdom soon. So it's fine, this is fine, everything's fine. Except when the king goes back home to his wife, because he's already married. His first wife...
This is a funny frame. And it also exploits Nora's opinions about this. I'll take you back home with me soon. I just have to take care of something first. I don't have any other options, but sure. And she's drawn like a male character who's just dumbstruck with a face in a series like, I don't know, Demon Slayer. Demon Slayer, My Hero Academia, maybe a really funny in-between panel of a reaction shot or a joke from One Piece or Fire Force or some type of shonen battle anime that is disguised as a rom-com. Again, modern morality is compartmentalized onto a story that comes from a time of fiction where people were a lot more mature and a lot more brutal with the stories that they write.
Things fine, except when the king goes back home to his wife, because he's already married. His first wife begins to suspect that something is awry, and when she questions his secretary, he admits that, yeah, her husband has a secret family. Furious, the queen devises a plan. She orders the secretary to deliver a message to Talia, saying that the king misses his children and wants them brought to the palace. Then, when they arrive, she promptly orders the cook to serve the children to her husband for dinner. The cook doesn't do that, and secretly hides them with his wife and serves some lamb for dinner instead. The queen watches with delight as her husband heartily tucks into the meal, and whenever he compliments the food, she responds, "Eat, eat, you are eating of your own," until he gets so fed up with her, he gets up and leaves. Still not satisfied, the queen pulls the same trick with Talia, and when she confronts her for being a homewrecker, Talia counters that she didn't have any say in the matter since she was asleep at the time, which is true. But the queen isn't having any of it and orders Talia to be burned alive in the courtyard. Presumably stalling for time, Talia kneels and asks if she can at least take off her clothes first. And thinking that it would be a waste for such a beautiful gown to be destroyed, the queen agrees. With each layer of clothing Talia removes, she lets out a loud scream until the final layer when, presumably hearing all the screaming, the king appears at the last minute and demands to know what's going on. Whereupon, the queen calls him out for his adultery and reveals her entire vile plot. To which the king responds level-headedly by having the queen and his secretary cast into the fire, and would have done the same to the cook before he revealed that the children were alive and well. The king promotes the cook to chamberlain, marries Talia, and they all live happily ever after. And this version ends with a proverb: "Those whom fortune favors find good luck even in their sleep." No. Basile. No. Okay, so this is the worst one. This is the most irredeemable version of the prince character. The king is just despicable. He cheats on his wife, sleeps with someone who couldn't give consent, and then leaves and totally forgets about her for like a year. And like, the narrative is clearly trying to justify this by making his wife like an actual child murderer, but if you have to then resort to cannibalistic infanticide to make your hero look good in comparison, you may have gone a bit too far.
They're fictional characters written by men that come from a time where they don't respect the opinion of women. They can't hear you call them a chud.
Cheats on his wife, sleeps with someone who couldn't give consent, and then leaves and totally forgets about her for like a year. And like, the narrative is clearly trying to justify this by making his wife like an actual child murderer, but if you have to make your villain resort to cannibalistic infanticide to make your hero look good in comparison, you may have gone a bit too far. So this isn't a good version of the story, but it is the most transparent, clear-cut depiction of cause and effect that we've seen so far. It's not the object itself, the spindle, that is so dangerous. There's nothing on a spindle to prick your finger on. It's the actual mechanical process of spinning fibers together that's the issue. The cause of her sleep-like death is the flax splinter embedded in her finger, and it just needs to be removed for her to wake up. It still only makes sense in that dreamy, surreal way that fairy tale logic works, but the way everything's explained is much more straightforward. And yet, it's almost more notable for what's missing. No fairy godmothers, no insulted bad fairy, no golden plates, no 100 years sleep affecting the entire castle, and no briars concealing it. Elements that, up until now, seemed inseparable from Sleeping Beauty just aren't here. The Brothers Grimm knew about Pentamerone, even openly praising it, but we don't know if Perrault did. There's overlap for sure. Out of Perrault's 8 fairy tales, 4 of them have a direct counterpart in Pentamerone, and Basile did actually use the fairy godmother story beat in his version of Snow White. In that story, the fairies bless the child at birth, but one of them trips and is so mad about it that she curses the child to die by a comb being left in her hair. And when that happens, her mom keeps her body in a crystal coffin locked in the basement, which is why on her deathbed, she warns her brother to never, ever, under any circumstances, look in the basement before promptly handing him the key and dying. But But much later, when he warns his wife, she doesn't listen and discovers the body, freaks out, and rips the comb out of her hair, which wakes her up. And that's beat for beat what happens in Bluebeard. If Perrault is not pulling directly from Basile's stories, then they are at the very least pulling from more or less the same sources. Sources like Persephorist. Persephorist is an absurdly lengthy medieval chivalric romance estimated to be written in French around 1340 by an unknown author. The story is a founding myth of a pre-Christian Britain and references several key players in Arthurian legend, like King Arthur, Merlin, and Lancelot, but it also pulls broadly from Greek and Roman history and mythology, and several...
Wait, stand aside, chat. The modern night white woman is about to explain the Chudisms and Arthurian lore to us. This should be good.
gods and goddesses are just also there, doing their thing, and one section just so happens to bear a striking resemblance to Sleeping Beauty, between the royal knight Troilus and the princess he serves, the Lady Zelendine. One of the defining features of...
Do you guys remember when people tried to cancel Greek mythologies for being problematic? Now, Saffronet, what's problematic about a god king literally flying up to women, rizzing them up, tricking them into having sex with them, which thus curses them to immediately become pregnant with his child and give birth on the fucking spot? If not literally incinerating them when he reveals his godly nature and reduces them to ash. There's nothing problematic about that.
Chivalric romance is the concept of courtly love, and its portrayal of the very specific relationship between a lady of noble birth and her chosen knight in her service, and the element of the unstoppable, borderline divine, ennobling power of love it creates. According to the conventions of courtly...
Otherwise known as grooming. Ain't got nothing to say about that, do you?
Love, the power of love transforms you into a better, stronger, more noble person. It reframes every fight, every great deed performed as not self-serving, but a selfless act to attain honor. Not for yourself, but for the woman you serve. And whether or not this was the intention of the author, the inclusion of the goddess Venus and her dominion over lovers makes the very act of loving someone a divine state of being and blessing of the gods.
Now, this is where what we watched and what we talked about on the last Versus chat actually comes into play. Because, as we now know, especially since we're talking about the different types of affection that a person can have, the kind of love that comes from the basis of a man fighting for a woman's honor is not so much for him to obtain her favor and thus her panties. It's about the fact that women are not expected to fight their battles for them and require a champion to represent their will in the conflict that they are trying to resolve. So, courtly love, as is described to the type of royalty and respect and decency in public, is about a man fighting for a woman's behalf on her honor as both a potential secret lover bodyguard, but more specifically as literally her sword and her shield. Which, you know, falls under that thing you don't like, patriarchy, where men are responsible for women's safety. You see, Scott Pilgrim already beat you this, girl! Scott obtained the power of love. Then Scott obtained the power of self-respect. You're being beaten out by a fucking left-leaning liberal who already did it better, both in book form and in movie form. I swear to fucking God. I swear to fucking God, Neuralities. I know why you needed it, horror. Today has been depressing. Nobody look up what happened to Michelle Trusting-Bird. Nobody look up what happened. It didn't happen. We're in the other timeline.
And this framework is going to be instrumental to our examination of this narrative. So with that in mind, let's take a look at our oldest Sleeping Beauty, Troilus and Zelendine. Troilus is sailing on the open seas and is finding something fierce to be reunited with the maiden that he serves, his best friend, the love of his life, the Princess Zelendine, when he just so happens to run into some sailors from the Kingdom of Zeland, because a terrible accident has befallen the Princess Zelendine. Some time ago, the princess just suddenly collapsed and hasn't awoken since, and nobody seems to know why or how this happened. So they take Troilus back home with them, and he gets started on his plan to save her. So he begins his investigation into what could have caused her illness by analyzing the testimonies of several key witnesses. According to one old woman, Zelendine was with her cousins, who were taking turns idly spinning flax, but right after Zelendine took the distance,
I was literally zoned out trying to type what I'm trying to put on this image that I didn't notice she was trying to do a bit with Ace Attorney. Again, you don't hate fucking localizers enough. Anyways,
the staff and began to spin, she fainted and hasn't woken up since. The people suspect that it's only through the favor of the goddess Venus, who Zelendine always honored, that she's being kept alive and healthy. And then the old woman does something to Troilus that gives him amnesia and also drives him fully insane. The text just doesn't explain what she does, so for all we know, it could be straight up magic, a Jedi mind trick, or maybe just a good old-fashioned bonk on the head.
Or she decided to sexually assault him, gave him that and then wiped his mind, because the power of penis is mightier.
She does this because her son is also in love with the princess, and she doesn't want Troilus getting in the way, I guess. Anyway, Troilus wanders around until he ends up at the king's castle, where the court fool loudly proclaims that this is the man that will save the princess. The king doesn't really believe the fool, but lets Troilus wander around where he pleases anyway, and luckily, he stumbles into the Temple of Venus, where she appears to him in a dream and restores his mind by wiping her saliva on his eyelids. An orthodox method, but okay. Troilus immediately continues his investigation and learns that, according to the midwives, the illness is probably due to a divine punishment. See, there's this local custom where, when a child is about to be born, a banquet table should be set for 3 goddesses: Lucina, goddess of childbirth, at the head, with Themis, goddess of fate, and Venus, goddess of lovers, at either side. The midwives suspect that the banquet must have been unsatisfactory in some way, and at least one of the goddesses must have been insulted and caused this terrible fate to befall Zelendine. Because it's a divine affliction, the king placed her in the highest room of a tower and locked every entrance except for the top window facing east, so that the sun god might pull double duty with his side hustle as the god of medicine and heal her. Troilus happens to run into the old woman's son, kicks his ass, takes his armor back, and sets off to find the tower, and failing that, prays to Venus for guidance. She responds by telling him not to worry about it, because once he penetrates the tower's defenses, he'll find the sleeping maiden and realize that the cure was inside of him the whole time. Confused, he asks for clarification, and Venus insists that life finds a way, and to stop asking and just go for it, dude. When he eventually does find the very impenetrable tower, after agonizing over a plan until nightfall, Troilus is so tired, hungry, and lovesick that he rationalizes that he has the power of the gods and true love on his side, so he dives headfirst into the moat. Now on the other side facing a literal insurmountable wall, this causes him to sulk so loudly that Zephyr, the west wind, shows up and offers to carry him up, but only on a few conditions. Once he's up there, he must act exactly as Venus has instructed, and after midnight, he must come back to the window and do whatever Zephyr asks of him. Troilus would do anything for Zelendine, so of course he agrees, and Zephyr carries him swiftly to the top. Nervous now that he's finally here, Troilus lights a candle, pulls back the canopy to see Zelendine sleeping, completely nude, and once he gets over his initial embarrassment, he's deeply sad to see her in this condition. He yearns to give her a single kiss, but realizes that would be a very bad, no-good thing to do, as he's already violated the code of chivalry by breaking into a lady's bedchamber without permission, and it'd be unthinkable to actually touch her while she's asleep. But then he immediately stops thinking with his brain, because after all, he reasons, kissing can be medicinal and revive a person who's fainted, so he tries this method out more than is probably medically necessary. When this doesn't do anything, Troilus laments that Venus promised that he would know what to do when he got here, but he still doesn't know how to cure her. To which Venus arrives invisibly, calls him pathetic, and tells him to get in there, champ, and go for a home run! He's tempted, but hesitates. His feelings of loyalty to Zelendine explicitly state that doing so would be a betrayal to the person he loves, and he could not be considered a friend to her in any capacity afterwards. This modicum of restraint infuriates Venus to the point that she uses her powers to make Troilus consumed with an unthinking fiery passion, and then appears before him, calling him a coward, unworthy of his lady. Venus sounds a lot less like the goddess of love in this section, and a lot more like her sometimes father, as she insists that
Amal, this character sounds like she's the goddess of rape! How dare you rape this character! The dramatic reading is what makes it annoying. The visuals just add to the annoyance. I can't spell. My sense of humor is fucked.
worthy of his lady. Venus sounds a lot less like the goddess of love in this section, and a lot more like her sometimes father, as she insists that, in fact, Zelendine would want him to do it, no matter how angry she might pretend to.
Did she draw this all herself? I thought she used to draw Yaoi of the MH Boys. Let's assume that she drew them herself, considering how much she is in love with the concept and the idea. And she likes to do all of this, usually with visual aids. That makes her desire of what she wants to explain more malicious, because she's literally typing it with anime subtropes, which is why I'm so annoyed with what she's choosing to force into her criticisms of the fairy tales and from the people which they come from. I'm not saying that she can't criticize the fairy tales. What I'm annoyed with is that she is, again, as I've said already, refusing, as a key main idea of my criticism of her, forgetting the time periods that these were written in, and desperate to try and... I need a word for this. She's trying to illustrate how disgusting and nasty the work is, so that she can earn the clout that comes from exposing people to something that they should hate, but doing so in a way that it makes it palatable, and somehow missing the context that the very thing she says she's interested in, she is actively doing. Again, you can't hate localizers enough.
To be later. Yikes. After Zelendine, Venus sounds a lot less like the goddess of love in this section, and a lot more like her sometimes father, as she insists that, in fact, Zelendine would want him to do it, no matter how angry she might pretend to be later. Yikes. After Troilus is finished, and just as Zephyr is about to take him away, the door is opened by the later. Yikes. After Troilus is
how could a female goddess tell you to rape a woman?
The door is opened by the king and his sister, who were alerted by the light from the candle Troilus lit. And what they see, from their perspective, is standing on the windowsill of the tallest tower, a knight clad in full armor lit only by pale moonlight, in one swift motion mount a colossal bird and take off silently into the dead of night. The king is convinced that must have been Mars, god of war, one of their direct ancestors, and noticing his daughter's somewhat pale face, thinks he must have given her some medicine to help with her illness, while his sister, noticing the sheets, realizes he probably did a bit more than that, but decides to play it cool and keep quiet. 9 months later, Zelendine gives birth to a baby boy, and while trying to nurse, he sucks on one of her fingers, and only a few moments later, Zelendine wakes up feeling fine, but weirdly exhausted. The aunt shows the princess her newborn son, to which she bursts into tears of disbelief. Her aunt tries to reassure her that the god Mars is probably the father, and seeing how she's awake now, probably did it to save her life, and now they have this sick demigod boy heir to add to the family. So really, it all worked out for the best. And now the aunt can finally reveal Zelendine's tragic backstory. For you see! On the day of Zelendine's birth, the aunt was the one in charge of setting up the table for the 3 goddesses, and after finishing her task, she stayed nearby the door to eavesdrop. Everything went as normal, except Themis' setting was missing a knife, as it had fallen down under the table unnoticed. Lucina blesses the child with a healthy body, but Themis, feeling slighted, declares that from the first spin of linen that she pulls from the distaff, a splinter will prick her finger, and in this way she will immediately fall asleep and will not wake up until it is sucked out. To which Venus vows in return that she will absolutely make sure that the splinter is sucked out, no matter what. The aunt concludes her tale by saying that the gods must have wiped that memory from her mind until now, so that she couldn't interfere with destiny. But also, Brian's translation doesn't specify that the knife was missing because it happened to fall down, or that the gods erased her memory, implying that it wasn't just a chance accident and that it is entirely the unnamed aunt's fault.
Remember what I said about the gods choosing to play with mortal lives like their playthings on a fucking chessboard? Da-da!
And with that, the mystery is finally solved, which does nothing to cheer Zelendine up, because knowing why it happened doesn't exactly make her feel any better about it. When, just then, a bird with a human face and the chest of a woman takes the child, literally tells them not to worry about it, and then just flies away. Okay, fine. Eventually, Zelendine recovers from the whole ordeal, until about a year later, when the king decides it would be a great idea for her to get married to some other royal knight, this guy, Nervin. When Troilus catches wind of this, he shows up in disguise at the royal tournament, beats his ass, and afterwards, they all sit down for a lovely, if slightly tense dinner. Which, unfortunately, is just enough time for Nervin to ask Zelend for permission to marry his daughter, which he does, and then proceeds to tell Zelendine the good news. She asks if they can give her until noon tomorrow for her to think it over, which they agree, which should give her just enough time to run away, because she's already in love with Troilus, and she's fully prepared to just book it into the woods instead of marrying some other guy. Remembering that mysterious knight was also from Royalville in Scotland, the same as Troilus, she asks her maids to send him a message so that they might talk in secret. When he arrives, she is overjoyed to see that it's her beloved friend. Finally reunited, Troilus explains everything to her, including a vision about their son, who is being looked after by the gods, and has been prophesied to bring glory to Britain. Zelendine is upset by what Troilus did to her, but accepts that it's not really either of their fault, as the blame lies entirely at the feet of the gods, manipulating both fate and them. They decide to run away together back to Great Britain and finally get married. Before she leaves, she calls out to her maids to tell her father and aunt that Mars is taking her back home because they're forcing her to marry against her will, and so ends the tale of Troilus and Zelendine. Perseforest is a fascinating variant for a number of reasons. One very surprising addition being that Troilus and Zillandine already knew each other and were already in love. That is so wild that that plot beat hasn't survived to seemingly any other classic versions, because it erases a lot of the problems in the later editions of True Love's kiss being to a complete stranger, because it would legitimately be True Love's kiss because they're already in love. Meeting and falling in love with the prince before the main events of the story has become such a commonplace practice in modern fairy tale retellings that I'm just gobsmacked to see it present here.
Then the elevator music. We have to read this. Okay, so apparently in the 1987 Grimm's fairy tale classic Snow White, she doesn't end up with this boy Klaus, and I can only deduce that it was either some sort of communication error from the staff or perhaps a creative coup, question mark, question mark, question mark. Despite all the visual evidence to the contrary, she ends up with some other prince that they introduce out of nowhere in the last 30 minutes of the runtime. Like, I didn't edit that abrupt cut from Klaus and her loving spinning and holding hands to an unmoving dead-eyed headshot of the prince. That's uncut footage. They literally Sam, Frodo, and Rosie Cotton these three, and I'm just like, why would you do this? This, Noralities, is when you are the victim of what we constantly tell people, which is believing that they can ship their way through their issues. No, I'm so sorry. The work is not about anything to do with that goddamn bullshit. Because it's not about what you're comfortable for with the readings that you have, not holding to the modern progressive values that came from traditional works from multiple cultures that have passed through oral traditions. I'm so sorry that you had to read stories that had to deal with rape characters. But bro, what the fuck is wrong with you to the point that you are making it more annoying and more grating to basically give us the meme format to make jokes at your expense? Because, hey, this guy and this girl know each other from their childhood. Clearly that means they have been bred to fuck! No! Unfortunately, for anybody who's wondering, based on what I talked about before on the last Versus chat, Noralities has defined herself as a men and women cannot be friends ever. No! But she did it in a nice way. Boys and girls can't be friends, and men and women can't be friends, because if they met each other in their childhood and they were very sweet on each other, they are meant to be. Never mind what she'll draw when it comes to that sex scene. You know, if she's bold enough to do it. She might just put him embracing her in a pose like this and draw a big yikes over it. Soft women. Soft women. Not even once.
And yet, on the other hand, because of the conventions of courtly love, the portrayal of the assault from a moral perspective in this version is very wishy-washy. This is the only version to plainly acknowledge that assault is not a cool thing that heroes do, but then immediately sidesteps the issue by placing both the action and blame firmly at the feet of the gods. The whole concept—
My internet so much. I love my internet provider so fucking much. I tried to explain the power of the domain expansion Ultimate Breed Press, and it immediately fucking killed the stream. Again. Twice in the same instance. Anyways, Nora, when you said that the way that we see love between knights and wards are going to be important to understanding old fairy tales, as well as if you have to resort to using bad thing to make your heroes and villains look insert moral framework here, you're doing a Juddism, that does not fucking work in this instance. Do you know why it doesn't work in this fucking instance? Because ultimately, yes, they can blame the problem on the consequence of the gods. Because unlike a Byron-esque hero who makes a choice to actually nut over the beloved girl that he's entranced to, Shinji, you have forgotten the fact that if he was literally forced by a god to do so, he's not responsible for his agency and his actions. So, in the writing of these men, these old French men that you hate, that they don't have the moral standards of modern progressivism, they don't consider a man to be a man if he can't make his own choices. He literally became a golem the moment that she possessed his will and forced him to do the action. So he recognized what was wrong and didn't do it thus holding to the basic standard of what a man is supposed to do in the society, and a god stole his will and did it any fucking ways, and in your mind, well, it's kind of okay, because, you know, it was true love. He was impregnating her as a bro. You know, as a bro, my man, I have to put a baby in my best girlfriend. You know, I've never been sexually attracted to her in this way, but to save her life, I gotta give her the dick. Sometimes you gotta ask yourself whether or not progressive women really like women, because they demonstrate that they don't understand or like men. Just gotta work that in there. Anyways, let's roll that back a couple of seconds.
Thing that heroes do, but then immediately sidesteps the issue by placing both the action and blame firmly at the feet of the gods. The whole concept of chivalry is so diametrically opposed to this plot beat that you can see the narrative come to a grinding halt, as the author has to bend over backwards to try to justify Troilus' actions.
Yes, Norelli. Because they wanted to tell a story, specifically to do something to do with what could be convincingly placed as kink. Yes, the author desperately wanted to take advantage of the narrative plot and effectively engage you in having to consider that they're just, you know, casually impregnating a friend. And that the problem of being a normal human woman came short to the expense of the free wills of gods and goddesses that bless the people that they are worshipped by. The entire point there is basically the rejection of faith and reliance on humans. But let's hear what dumb shit you have to say to this. Please make it make sense. Please make it make sense.
Sidesteps the issue by placing both the action and blame firmly at the feet of the gods. The whole concept of chivalry is so diametrically opposed to this plot beat that you can see the narrative come to a grinding halt, as the author has to bend over backwards to try to justify Troilus' actions. Troilus is still framed as a hero, despite doing an unheroic thing in these extremely specific, non-replicable circumstances.
Well, there's your reference to anime. She even did the fucking fade effect that makes it look like it's a fucking, domination love story. If the character doesn't have the agency to do the action himself, and the framing of the action is being done as a part of what has to happen to save the character, it has nothing to do with chivalry if it's not his choice. It wasn't his choice. I need to pee. I'm so annoyed. Speculate between yourselves in the chat. I'll be right back. animal crackers rocking my shit. Okay.
Is so diametrically opposed to this plot beat that you can see the narrative come to a grinding halt, as the author has to bend over backwards to try to justify Troilus' actions. Troilus is still framed as a hero, despite doing an unheroic thing in these extremely specific, non-replicable circumstances, but only because he was forced to, and because it was ultimately for heroic reasons. Whereas in Sun, Moon, and Talia, I did not get the impression that Basile thought that the king was a scumbag, even though he's the worst one. Like, it's an interesting narrative concept about free will, but in this specific situation, I don't think that defense would hold up in fairy tale court. Anyway.
Okay, but who gives a fuck about your goddamn fairy tale court? It's a fucking fictional story, Nora.
Perhaps the strangest thing about Persephorist is that, by starting the story from the prince's view, the Sleeping Beauty plotline effectively morphs into a mystery that the prince is working to solve through amateur sleuthing. Whereas in all other versions of the Sleeping Beauty tale, the events play out in reverse. The problem and eventual solution are delivered in a neat package right at the beginning. It's a strange feeling reading a mystery that everyone already knows the solution to. Like, imagine if Little Red Riding Hood started from the perspective of the huntsman. Her mom shows up in town looking for her daughter. She was supposed to be home hours ago, and it's about to get dark, and she's starting to get worried. And as you start walking through the woods, you see a small set of footprints that suddenly take a sharp turn to wander off the path, right next to a set of enormous wolf tracks. And the trail leads you to a small, isolated cottage, where you notice that the door is unlatched, and hangs open ever so slightly. Ugh, haunting. Like, I don't know about you, but there's no universe where I go in that house.
Yes, because you're Nora. However, that is an actual good example of reverse engineering storytelling to use a Rashomon mystery plotline to make for good character writing. They've learned how to do it because it's popular in Chinese, Japanese, and South Korean dramas. But as a writing narrative done for the American populace, because she only ever consumes anime and fucking progressive values American stories written by fucking queer and queered queer Q-U-E-E-R and queered Q-U-E-E-R-E-D writers, it ultimately has no bearing on the rest of the shit that people could take in, because unfortunately, for people like Nora, her viewpoint on this would make her, like me, somebody who would watch American Gods. But unlike somebody like me, who goes to see, hey, damn, it'd be really cool for them to be able to show off different versions of mythologies and how they choose to represent these characters, and how these actors bring them to life, she looks at each and every one of them and then looks at their background story to figure out whether or not she's allowed to support them based on whether or not they did a bad progressivism, and thus loses the ability to engage in the story despite presenting the framework upon which to present a good criticism. Because she latches on to the shit and she views it from her morals and her politics instead of latching onto the story and consuming the details and the content to understand and appreciate it while still having her reservations about the work. She cares so much more about how the sausage is made rather than that there is sausage on her plate.
But this might also explain why Sleeping Beauty, despite being the titular character of her own story, doesn't seem to actually do much in it. Because what if she wasn't supposed to be the protagonist in the first place? And I don't even mean the prince, I'm talking about her son. The framework of the Sleeping Princess narrative functions surprisingly well as a heroic origin story. A child of royal birth, conceived in a bizarre manner arranged by the gods, is then taken away to be raised in secret by those gods, in preparation for some prophesized destiny. In the case of Persephorist, that destiny is having a hand in the fictional founding of Great Britain, yet over time, with narrative drift, less and less significance was placed onto the child. Sun, Moon, and Talia includes the children's name in the title before hers, whereas Perrault drops the inclusion of the children's names until the birth aspect was removed entirely in the Grimm's version, and the story was reduced to, a princess is cursed to sleep and is woken by true love's kiss. The story, as we know it now, feels incomplete because it is, and I think there might be something to that. As far as we know, Persephorist is the oldest, still definitively recognizable Sleeping Beauty variant, and with all these other versions in mind, we can now reduce the story down to its most basic components. While other components of the stories vary, there is always a prince and princess, a divine insult, a prophecy of doom at the birth of a child, an enchanted sleeper, a maiden in a tower, and an unusual pregnancy resulting in the birth of a child, or sometimes twins. There aren't any myths that match up perfectly with all of these elements, but there are a few that are pretty similar, such as the ancient Greek myth about Danae. In that myth, the Oracle of Delphi prophesies that King Acreus' daughter, Danae, will give birth to a son that will kill him. So in order to avoid that, he locks her up, either underground or in a tower with no entry other than a skylight. Unfortunately, there's no walls that can keep out the gods, and Zeus impregnates her via shower of golden rain, and she eventually gives birth to a baby boy, the hero Perseus. When the king learns of this, he banishes them to the sea, and they wash ashore on an island, where King Polydectes wants to marry her against her will. He promises to drop the proposal if Perseus can achieve the impossible task of killing the Gorgon, which he does with some divine help, and then uses the head to turn Polydectes into stone. While traveling back home through the nearby kingdom of Ethiopia, he stumbles across the princess Andromeda, who, due to some good old-fashioned hubris, because her mom boasted that Andromeda was more beautiful than the gods, she's currently facing the divine punishment of being sacrificed to a sea monster. Perseus saves her, of course, and they get happily married. Much later, Perseus is competing in a tournament and accidentally misthrows a javelin and happens to hit a random spectator in the audience, killing King Acreus instantly and proving that trying to avoid fate is an exercise in futility. Although they've been rearranged slightly, this myth has all of the key story components for Sleeping Beauty, except for the enchanted sleeper, which seems like it would be kind of important for Sleeping Beauty.
Not in the case of the Greek mythology, because every single story in both Greek and even Roman mythology comes down to, bitch, you are just a fucking passerby. A god can knock you up and then turn you into their warrior and then dispose of you, then bring your soul back to the dead to torture you some more, and you just have to pray that you're not on their fucking hit list.
But Persephorus drew inspiration from a lot of different sources, so the enchanted sleeper could be an add-on from a totally different myth, like in Daedalion. In Ovid's Metamorphosis, Daedalion's daughter Chione is magically put to sleep by the gods and then impregnated with twin sons by Hermes and Apollo while sleeping. Combine these two myths together, bada bing bada boom, instant Sleeping Beauty. So, counterintuitively, it appears that the Danae myth is much older, more extensive, and has more in common with the core Sleeping Beauty story than the Daedalion myth, which seems to be a later addition that was added more for flavor than anything else. But if the story is missing the definitive enchanted sleeper, then can we even classify this as Sleeping Beauty? Well, to figure that out, there's one final piece.
Not much more of this is left before we come to a conclusion. This is 56 out of an hour and 26:12. So, roughly another 25 minutes.
Piece of the puzzle, a much older tale that should, hopefully, answer all of our remaining questions. Tale of the Doomed Prince. Papyrus Harris 500 is a collection of folktales and love poems. The papyrus itself has been dated to between around 1300 to 1100 BC, but the story itself is likely older, dating to between 1500 to 1200 BC, meaning it predates the Danae myth by roughly 1,000 years. So, tell me if any of this sounds familiar. A childless king prays to the gods for a son before going to bed with his wife. The gods hear him and grant the wish, and 9 months later she gives birth to a baby boy, where the goddess, the Seven Hathors, performs her duty of foretelling how the child will die, and she predicts that he will die by a crocodile, snake, or even a dog. Distressed and wanting to avoid this terrible fate, the king builds a stone house in the desert and fills it with everything his son could ever need so that he would never want to leave. Years later, the boy is looking out from the rooftop and sees a man and his dog, and, having never seen a dog before, asks his father if he can have one, and the king reluctantly gives in. When he grows up a bit more, he tells his father that it's pointless to keep him trapped for the rest of his life, and that he'd rather go out into the world and meet his fate head on, even if it means accepting his inevitable doom. He leaves with the king's blessing and travels north with his dog until he reaches the Mitannian kingdom, where the Prince of Nahran just so happens to have one daughter he's keeping at the top of a 100-foot tower, with only one window at the top, and has sent word to the allied princes that the one who reaches her window shall have her hand in marriage. Exhausted from traveling, our prince happens to stumble across the tower, and after feeding them a sob story, the other princes take him in as one of their own, cleaning him, feeding him, and bandaging his feet. When he asks why exactly they're all just jumping in front of this tower, they explain about the princess at the top and that whoever reaches the window gets to marry her. And our prince says that he would love to give it a try once he's fully recovered. So he just sits on the sidelines and watches them, while meanwhile the maiden at the top watches him. Eventually, he tries and leaps successfully to the top, probably with the help of a divine blessing, where the princess eagerly kisses and embraces him. When the news gets back to her father, he's displeased it isn't one of the princes that he summoned.
Jesus fucking Christ, stop it with these quick edits. So, we're just gonna skip over the fact that in this story, Nora, the prince in question is hello sailored by the princess. Or we're gonna skip over that? Because it feels like we're gonna skip over that. Because the prince doesn't get agency in the fact that she's chosen him when he's never had a conversation with her. So let's start there.
Eagerly kisses and embraces him. When the news gets back to her father, he's displeased it isn't one of the princes that he summoned.
Jesus fucking Christ. Allegedly, there's an untranslatable pun here where chariot warrior sounds similar to vagrant, which is why her dad reacts poorly. All over his body, then someone went in order to impart the news to her father and told him, somebody has reached the window of your daughter. Then the prince inquired about him, saying, the son of which of the princes? And he was told, a chariot warrior's son. It was from his stepmother's presence that he came in flight of the land of Egypt. Thereupon the prince of Nahrain became very much angered. He said, is this to the Egypt fugitive that I should give my daughter? Send him away. Or alternatively, if I could but enchant my feet, said the restoration of the negative, far from the certain indicatorative of the verb favors enchant. According to E. Cruz Anub, Cruz Anub, and I can't read that phrase. Zalus 113, 1986. The Prince of Narim misunderstood the word for chariot warrior as vagrant, and thus violently reacted on the Prince Egyptian's achievement in reaching the daughter's window.
And orders to send him away. But the princess grabs him and warns that if they send him away, she'll starve herself to death. And when her father sends men to kill him, she doubles down and says that if they kill him, she'll meet the same fate. At which point, her father relents, asks to see both of them, approves of the marriage, and they start living happily together. After some time, the prince confides the truth to his wife that he will meet a terrible fate by crocodile, snake, or dog. Alarmed, his wife urges him to get rid of the dog, which, since he's raised it since it was a puppy, he absolutely refuses to do. So she takes matters into her own hands to protect her doomed groom. She fills 2 bowls with wine and beer and leaves them next to her sleeping husband while she stays up and keeps watch. When, one night, a snake slithers out ready to bite him, but instead gets drunk on the wine, whereupon the wife grabs a hatchet and obliterates the snake. She excitedly wakes him up to tell him that they've managed to avoid one of the fates. However, only a few grabs a hatchet and obliterates the snake. She excitedly wakes him up to tell him
There's a world where, in an alternate reality, Nor gives up on trying to wokeify and or dechutify stories, mythos, legends, talking points, fairy tales, and video essays, and just becomes a fucking author. Or just an illustrator. Because if you can be able to draw like this, why are you not drawing comics? Fuck all this bullshit when you trying to fucking talk about things that have to do with fairy tales. Go make a webcomic series.
him that they've managed to avoid one of the fates. However, only a few days later he goes out for a short stroll alone, but the dog follows behind him, and then speaks, saying, "I am your fate," and chases him into a river, where a crocodile drags him away. The crocodile then says, "I am your fate, but I've been trapped in this lake for months, locked in battle with a demonic water spirit. I'll let you go if you help me kill the water spirit when he returns." On the dawn of the next day, the water spirit returns, and then nothing.
Because even though it was discovered intact during the 1800s, preserved for over 3,000 years, the house it was in exploded, and part of it burned to ash before it was translated. So we just don't know the ending, and probably never will. I don't know what I was expecting from 19th century British archaeologists. Like, the papyrus isn't.
Casual insults of the British for trying to preserve a scroll so you could then use it for video content on the internet so you could talk shit about white men. Da-da!
It's in the British Museum. Like, they didn't even give it back.
More insults, because, they didn't give it back. They didn't give it back. Hey, Nora, what happens when we take things from countries that like to destroy history? What do they like to do to their history pieces and their monuments? Discussé.
Okay, so at this point, all we can do is guess at the ending. Does he overcome his fate, or does he succumb to it? If this were a Greek tragedy, he wouldn't stand a chance, not without the help of divine intervention. But considering that he did manage to evade 2 of his deaths and then cut a deal with the last one, it is entirely possible that our doomed prince was able to overcome his fate and reach a happy ending. Somehow. But even without the ending, the tale of the doomed prince has finally put into place what has been nagging at me throughout this entire video. And full disclosure, this is truly just my best guesswork on what might have happened, so take my conclusion with a grain of salt, but I think we have enough pieces to form a decent picture of what happened. This is why the Sleeping Beauty tale has drifted so much over time, because the tale of the doomed prince is a double, locked tower myth. A prince locked away to avoid a prophecy of doom, and a princess locked away as a test of marriage for whoever reaches her window. And about 1,000 years later, the shape of the Danae myth has remained remarkably similar, although the events and roles have been reordered slightly. The Princess Danae is locked in a tower because of a prophecy of doom centered on her yet unborn son, and then her son travels to another country and saves an imprisoned princess from danger and then marries her. Once the Danae myth gets combined with Daedalus and Persephorest, then we finally have all the parts needed to form the first true Sleeping Beauty type: the Maiden in the Tower, the Enchanted Sleeper, and the Prophecy of Doom. But there's just one problem, because the name of Daedalus's enchanted sleeper, Hyoni, is the Greek word for snow. Sleeping Beauty has the same proto-origin stories as Rapunzel and Snow White. Depending on how you choose to slice the story, you can end up with any one of these outcomes. If you take the maiden in the tower section, you end up with Rapunzel. If you just use the enchanted sleeper, then that becomes Snow White. Combine them together with the prophecy of doom, and finally, you get Sleeping Beauty. That's why they're all so similar, and this is where things start to get complicated. Because if Persephars combined two different myths to make Sleeping Beauty, then 300 years later, when Giambattista Basile publishes his collection of 50 stories, he splits them apart again, into the oldest known variants of Rapunzel and Snow White. Remember how weird it was that Basile's version of Sleeping Beauty was the only one that used male astronomers instead of female goddesses or godmothers, because he used the fairy godmother's plot beat in his version of Snow White. So, bafflingly, Basile's version is the first and only Snow White variant to include the prophecy of doom. And this is going to become a pattern, as each new writer picks and chooses what elements to keep in one story or add or remove from another.
I repeat, you do not hate localizers enough. They've been ruining stories since before you even knew how to say their names in their maiden language.
65 years after Basile's death, by the time we get to Perrault, he only adapted 8 fairy tales, which did not include a version of either Rapunzel or Snow White, because he took the body in the basement from Basile's Snow White and turned it into Bluebeard. And this is going to have some wild ramifications. Remember how during Perrault's time, adapting fairy tales was considered to be a trendy pastime among aristocrats? Yeah, well, in 1698, 1 year after Perrault publishes his Mother Goose Tales, who arrives on the scene but Charlotte Rose de la Force, and she's got this great new fairy tale. It's called Percinet. And her version of Rapunzel has become, somehow, even more similar to Sleeping Beauty. Unlike Basile, in her version, the tower is meant to protect the maiden from some terrible fate, which comes to pass anyway when she gives birth to a twin boy and girl, and eventually they're all saved by a fairy godmother riding in a golden chariot. Now by this point, it's really hard to say who is pulling from what exactly. De la Force and Perrault both have a fairy riding in a golden chariot, which is an element used in the Greek play Medea, which Basile makes a direct reference to in Sun, Moon, and Talia, saying the wife is acting with the wrath of Medea. You've probably realized by now that trying to cleanly classify fairy tales is an actual nightmare, because ultimately, all stories are one story, which is fine unless you're the Grimm's brothers in 1812, in which case you've got a big problem. They're not just writing down one story, or 8, or 50, they're making a collection of 86 distinct tales, and of course they want to document their own version of Rapunzel, Snow White, and Sleeping Beauty. But this is the first time in almost 200 years that these stories have been put back in the same book together again, and now that they are, their sources are starting to look eerily similar. So, what do you do in that situation? You change some things. You adapt and swap them around. They take the part about a servant being ordered by an evil queen to cook a child for dinner and then tricking her by using an animal substitute and moved that into Snow White. Perrault had a bunch of failed attempts to wake the princess, like unlacing her bodice, so they added that as well, so the attempts on Snow White's life with the comb and the apple could be the rule of 3. And in their version of Rapunzel, they initially kept the fairy garden and the birth of the twin boy and girl, but they changed it to a sorceress and removed the pregnancy in the final edition in 1857. Oh, and they also specified that the prince lost his eyesight when he landed on the briars at the bottom of the tower, just to spite me personally, I guess. This is why their version of Sleeping Beauty is so incomplete. The ending is missing because it got cut up and pieced together with Rapunzel and Snow White over and over again. Combined, split apart, combined again into this stew of
And? Nora, and? That's how storytelling works. Modern writing conventions all do this. You're an anime watcher. How many derivative animes have you gotten from where they took a premise and then they threw in a plot hook? Come on. Get to the point!
cross-contaminated stories and ideas until it became something entirely new, and in some regards, better. In the modern day, we recognize these stories by the specifics that are unique to them: the poisoned apple, the spinning wheel, the long hair. And we kind of have to do that, because otherwise all fairy tales are just a mush of indistinguishable building blocks that can be arranged in any order to build a slightly different castle. And
no shit. And
honestly, that's what I really love about fairy tales. It's their ability to change. For some reason, I remember really clearly being a kid and seeing for the first time one of those clickbait-type articles about the real story of Sleeping Beauty, where they revealed that True Love's kiss wasn't what originally happened. And while that is true in some versions, it isn't true for the oldest one, the tale of the doomed prince. The assault was a later add-on from a different myth that could just as easily be taken out as it was put in, because one version of a fairy tale can't be more or less real than another. Sleeping Beauty, although she's always the titular character, is not always the main character. Sometimes her children come first, or her prince, or she's a cool origin story for her heroic son. Once, she was even a doomed prince meeting a terrible fate head-on, who rescued a princess from a tower and was saved by her in return. Sleeping Beauty's building blocks have so much potential to create a really good retelling, and I think it is kind of criminally underutilized.
And what kind of trans personality and ideology and or politics would you like to insert into it, Nora?
Like, what is this story's legacy? The ballet, The Adventure of Link, Shadow of the Colossus? Does her story truly start and end as a damsel needing to be saved? That's
Sure. And? See, Nora, your problem is that you start off prognosticating about, I can't believe they didn't do it progressive. And it doesn't have a direction that flows to relieve the pressure of the frustration of why you're wasting your time to tell us this, if not for money. And with years and years of time to reflect on your creative passions, you have not yet gotten to the point yet. But Carl, what about you? If it were me, and I made this video, I would say, hey, do you know that Legend of Zelda is actually Snow White? And then after doing all of this, I could bring it around to explain, but imagine how many other ways we could write something. And that would be a great that would be a great springboard to make a talking point. Like, we all know that stories evolve and change, especially when they get changed for a modern audience. But most of this is not useful to us, bro. It's really not.
not true for the other princesses. I could have made this video on any fairy tale, but I didn't need to for Cinderella, because as long as there's inequality in the world, we're never going to stop retelling that story. They eliminated the actual wolves from England before the Brothers Grimm even wrote Red Riding Hood down. Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and Tangled have clearly cemented their legacy for their stories, but Disney's Sleeping Beauty, a film so luxurious and splendid at production it cost $6 million US, over twice as much as the last 3 films, that when it only grossed $5 million, it resulted in massive company layoffs and almost destroyed the animation department. A studio that had already adapted Snow White and Cinderella into massively successful films just really struggled with this one. Snow White is outnumbered 7-1 by male characters, Cinderella has an entire comedic animal B-plot, and yet Aurora's impact on her film feels extremely absent compared to them. She's overshadowed by Maleficent, the fairies, the kings, and by this point in time, the animators had finally figured out how to animate a compelling male hero, something they had wanted to do since Snow White, but was just too taxing for a team of all-male animators to pull off. Nobody wanted to draw the prince because it was boring, okay? They wanted to draw pretty girls and funny animals and villains, and honestly...
Yeah, because in the narrative through line of a story, the most important part isn't the protagonist. It is the struggle of the plot. It is the consistencies of what are the barriers that stand in the way of the character. No shit. But you're right. Do these 10,000-year-old campfire stories pass the Bechdel test? That's the most important part.
Same. So, not only is the prince very present in this film, he gets to fight a dragon at the end. Like, genuinely, parts of this film are so good, and it is truly gorgeous to look at, and Maleficent is my favorite, and Prince Philip is so good.
So, demonstrating the exact same talking point that I just said, which means your entire spiel is moot. I hate.
Good. And I love the fairy godmothers. We never get 3 old ladies just doing stuff outside of murder mysteries. But I can't recommend this movie as a film to anyone, because the whole is weaker than the sum of its parts. Aurora is supposed to be the main character. She's the titular...
Man, this is a really good classic and is the jumping off point for how we will judge other things that use its work. But I can't tell people to go watch this film. I'm a tastemaker, me. Let me ruin your taste with my horrible takes.
character, and she's just not present for the film.
Yeah, because Aurora is the weakest part of Sleeping Beauty. Unfortunately, because of the framework of the story making her a damsel in distress, where her agency is not necessary for the plot to continue forward, she is a human MacGuffin.
Aurora doesn't even appear on screen until almost 20 minutes into the film, gets about 30 minutes of being awake, passes out, and is woken up with 10 minutes left, but doesn't get any more dialogue. And it's not a very long film. At 1 hour and 20 minutes, she's only present for about half of the runtime, and her absence persists. In 2014, the second of the now infamous live-action Disney remakes was made for Sleeping Beauty. This was their chance to do it again, but better. And is the spotlight cast on Aurora in that film? No. This time, the story is from the perspective of Maleficent, inspired more by the popular musical Wicked than anything else.
Yeah, because giving the narrative of a supposed misunderstood villain a reinterpretation is more interesting than just trying to do the story over again with specific hook beats. Because the idea is to punch it up and make it different and interesting. The same way that Wicked did to the books.
The modern criticism that Sleeping Beauty doesn't get to do anything in her own story is true. She doesn't have to overcome any obstacles or put in any hard work for her happy ending, which makes her less compelling than her underdog counterparts.
And you see, the problem with that, Nora... I'll use this frame. The problem with trying to force agency of characters who exist as MacGuffins into a story is that you ultimately end up adding extra fluff that doesn't need to fucking be there. And thus, you have the problem of why you leave details and stories and concepts on the cutting room floor. If I want to write a story, I'm going to involve the parts that I'm really interested in, and I'm going to find the way to fit those into the story. And the more time that I develop the idea and the concept, the more room I have to involve things into the idea and concept. But the framework of the narrative and the plot devices I use, the tropes that I use, inform my decisions. Whether I follow them, I shirk them, I joss... Well, technically shirking and jostling are the same thing. Although, no, they're not. Jostling is when you take a concept and you completely trick people into believing that it's going to be one thing, but it was completely something else entirely, so basically misdirection. Whether I play them straight, I jost them, I completely defy them, I subvert them, I invert them, or I deconstruct and reconstruct them, I still have to use them. Using the plot lines of Sleeping Beauty will have a requirement that no matter how much agency you give to that character, the bitch still gotta fall asleep. You ain't gotta impregnate her. You ain't gotta impregnate her as a deal between old childhood friends by being a bro. You don't have to impregnate her by being driven into a lust fiend phrase and turned into the ultimate gooner by a god or some kind of divine force to do it. You are going to need to have the MacGuffin piece. And unfortunately, a person as a plot device is always going to be bad. So if you make the person as a plot device also have agency, you end up with a Mary Sue! Every fucking time! And this writing convention, where they need to have agency, is literally a consequence of people trying to make progressive modern standards applied to traditional values in a piece of work. It doesn't work. Unless you find a way to frame the device as part of the subversion. If you deconstruct the concept, then you are able to understand whether or not the talking point has saliency as a criticism. See, you can tell that I'm really pissed off because I haven't played a single fucking hand for all 2 hours and 24 minutes. When the framing device requires the MacGuffin to have agency to be involved in the plot of the story, you actually end up with an origin myth. Not so much for setting up another character, but for setting up the motivations that start the story in medias res. I'll give you an example, chat. Miss Marvel, her Disney Plus series, is where in medias res, she then gets involved into the plot of the Marvels. Whether or not you understand how her abilities work, if you watch the Disney Plus series she comes from, the idea of making her a Muslim girl who is a part of an ethno-religious culture, and that the Noor dimension and the quantum entanglement bangles, the quantum drives, I actually think they call them the quantum bangles, the involvement of how they work in the basis of the story, dressing up fucking, I forget what that black actress's name. I know it's a hyphenated name, and one of the parts of it is common. I believe she's the ghost character, but they had her play a really bad fucking, a really bad Marvel villain for that. She was supposed to be Kree or some shit. Her entire backstory, her characters, her powers, how she learns to use them, how she gets her super suit, the reason why she's supposed to be a Muslim character that really cares about her family, and the reason why she exists is because she did some timey-wimey bullshit to involve herself in why she and her family even came to the Americas and escaped from the apartheid that was happening in India. All of that is inconsequential to her involvement in the film, because you still get enough context to know how she ends up getting warped into the story based on what's happening and how she gets involved in the plot. You could say, wow, that's a really shitty way for you to involve them, but the same DNA, the same bone structure exists there. Do you know why? Because Kamala Khan's Miss Marvel is a fucking mantle that is passed down to her from, if it was from the comic book orientation, the same leotard being given to her by Carol Danvers in her time as Miss Marvel before she became Captain Marvel. And where from Marvel, as a throwaway character meant to make fun of the original Captain Marvel, now known as Shazam, is instead the passing of multiple torches of multiple different handles that apply to multiple different characters that come from the same origin. Because Polar, aka Spectrum, and Captain Marvel, and Kamala Khan's mantle of Miss Marvel are all people that come from the same character background. And they all intermix because the way in which they've been introduced into the MCU is a play on the idea of how you accomplish getting that, as they use in the MCU, variant of the character to function. So the concept of the multiverse being applied on the narrative allows them to fuck around and basically make the black one, who's supposed to come before her, instead be the daughter of the friend character that in the X-Men universe that she crossed into as a part of the Foxmen, basically has no knowledge of who she is, as portrayed by Lashana Lynch. Thus making, and tactically in total, 4 different versions of a character, all appearing in the exact same medium, because they come from the different origin point, but the writers in question got into the kitchen and said, let's make these ingredients work, and ended up making the literary and physical creation of a concept of emulsion for the characters. Because they were oil and water being bound together with thickening fat fibers, like mayonnaise, and being spread on the sandwich of a story to make a main idea sandwich that accomplished bringing out multiple pieces and parts to move in the same direction so that you still had a satisfying conclusion, being your satiated appetite for story, or a literal fucking sandwich. Am I the only person in school that was taught literary devices as a part of a sandwich? Am I crazy? Is my generation from 2008 to 2012 the generation that had to deal with learning about things in that way? Because I swear, they were doing it way before fucking high school. I swear they were doing this as a part of literary devices from fucking middle school and shit. Sidebar, just to keep people engaged, by the way. Your problem, Nora, exists in that at any point in part with the creation of and the introduction of characters, to make this a one-to-one comparison between Cinderella, Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, Aladdin, and just off the top of my head, let's just take The Hunchback of Notre Dame, or Pocahontas. You would get extremely upset if the origin of Carol Danvers, Monica Rambeau, Kamala Khan, and I forget what the mother character's name is, all had comparisons between them that the moment you look at their backstory, you see some kind of chilly bullshit that makes you dislike them. So you have to find a way to discredit them because this doesn't gel in my politics. When a good writer, regardless of their background, would just simply say, I know it goes against what I would believe as a tenement of my own belief. But guess what? You read that shit anyways, didn't you? That means it was good enough. You're so stuck on the thimbles and the reeds that you get blinded on the briar patch of your own ego. Because you are so fucking consumed by the idea of ideology that you are never satiated by your perpetual constant consternation of concepts, ideas, and stories that you try to carve God from the wood of your hunger and are still not famished. That was a bar. I disgusted myself just now. Ooh. Carved from the wood of your hunger and you're still not famished. Ooh. Ooh. Why did I just get Old Testament? Oh my fucking God. Anyways, I'm gonna repeat it again. Because you keep being starved by things not being good enough, that you keep being famished as you carve out concepts to feed the wood of your hunger, as you keep trying to carve God, you keep procrastinating about stories, and instead of appreciating them, you try to find a way to say, and that's bad. And that's why I'm a fucking hater. Okay, let's move forward. We only have like 13 minutes left.
But unlike them, her passivity has somehow stuck even into new adaptations, and as writers, we keep overshadowing her with other characters in the story. If she appears in a fairy tale mashup like Shrek or Into the Woods, she's usually a footnote, a throwaway joke at best. We ignore
Comedy! Shrek is literally comedy! Comedic! Ugh!
her. She is not a person, she is an objective.
Yes, she's a MacGuffin! Oh no!
Couple throwaway lines, a little flourish to flesh out someone else's story.
Well, you see, cope. Sometimes it happens. I'm sorry, we've tried giving Zelda her own video games. You guys literally didn't play it on the CDI. So we had to put it in the context of a side story of something that's happening on the other end. So, to use that example, one of the most recent Zelda games put out was Echoes of Wisdom, which I guess you can say is like Oracle of the Ages, Oracle of Seasons, Echoes of Wisdom. It completes the triumvirate connection of those triumvirates of games. Because the same gameplay that the person is experiencing while you're playing Zelda, there's an entire video game that you could make based on what's happening to Link inside the Silent Realm. Or the fucking the other universe shit, right? So like Sheik, Zelda's Hyrulean magic disguise, after learning how to do Sheikah magic and hand signs as a ninja, and how she uses that to disguise herself to hide from Ganondorf. There's an entire video game plotline where you could go back to the child timeline, to the in-between state between the finality of that story that splits off into the doomed timeline, the adult timeline, and the child timeline, where you finally get to play Zelda in that in-between section. But unfortunately, it's the Rogue One of Zelda. Why? Because we already know how the story precludes and how it ends. No matter what you do with that storyline, in order for you to write a different ending that allows Zelda to be the one to conquer over the situation, has drastic and dire consequences on the actual placement it has in the timeline. Because we know how the story begins, and we know how the story ends. So if you decide to change the narrative, you thus create a branching timeline from the consequences of the actions upon the narrative. For you, you'd say, yeah, and it's better, and it's diverse, and it's progressive, and it doesn't make me feel icky, and all the women who watch it can be able to say that it passes the Bechdel test, and I don't have to feel disgusting telling people about it, and I can feel proud that I tell them this story. But you probably end up making a piece of a product that people don't resonate with. And not just because nostalgia, but specifically the way that you have to write that story. If you decide to write it as the wildest fucking sweat fest of the crazed delusion between the hate fuck stories written by a fucking feminist and the horrible male feminism of saying women can have agency too, if you make chic soy, niggas are gonna hate you. Because for all the different versions and all the different interpretations, you're not about to tell me that the Zelda that would put her trust in Link would not then go on to be the mother or the fucking ancestor of the Zelda that in Twilight Princess basically only treats Link like a fucking toy soldier. Because she's a lot more regal and she's a lot more disconnected from him. Plus, Linkle, to reference what Saffronet's talking about, isn't even Link. It's just another fucking woman. It's just a girl who has his comparative name.
But when viewed from her perspective, Sleeping Beauty is a deeply tragic figure. She's dealt a raw deal, cursed in her infancy not because of anything she did, but as a punishment for her father's mistake. Or worse, for no reason other than the cold turning of the wheel of fate. Nora, maybe, I don't know how this hasn't occurred to you yet, because you haven't mentioned it the entire time in the video, maybe on top of it being a consequence of the god, it's a part of that, what was that word I used? Foible, where, I don't know, when the father, in any interpretation of the story, whether it be, I'm being cursed because I raped a fairy when I fell in love with her, and I chose to spurn her and not love her, or I fucked up and I insulted the gods by not praying to them hard enough, or I fucked up the table setting for them. It's supposed to be a lesson of the sins of the father fall on the son and the daughter. Anyways. The only time she's ever warned about the danger and given the knowledge that might let her defend herself is when she's a boy, a doomed prince. Otherwise, she lives her life in blissful ignorance until finally the other shoe drops. And when she wakes up from death, she's married to the prince because he saved her. He won her hand in marriage. He completed the objective. He fought through the bramble. He penned.
Hero's journey. That's the difference, Nora. The difference between all of these variants is that when the character is put in the portrayal of a man, it's a hero's journey. And just like Odysseus, just like all of these men in these different variations, in the case of the Doomed Prince, as I made the joke when I wrote down the script here, the agency in choosing what was his wife was not his. She chose him, and then when the plot came to the hand of the father for having put her in the tower in the first place to use her as a prize was used against him, she threatened to use her own agency to kill herself if he tries to kill him. And much in the case of the hero's journey, when it comes to people in agency and choices, because we can see how the character develops, it doesn't work the same way if you just decide to have a fucking feminism and complain about women not having choices. Because sometimes a story starts off with a hook that says, I have to avoid a fate that's been prognosticated for me. And unfortunately, in the hero's journey, yes, women usually get used as a shorthand as a prize. And do you know why that is, Nora? Do you know why that is, Nora? Do you know why that is? I can tell you. Let's play a game, chat. What do you think old white and German and European intellectuals thought outside of men was the most important thing to society? She's given the answer multiple times in this video. It's something she really fucking hated. What was the most important thing? What was the most important thing? Anybody want to take a blind guess? Beasts of burden. No. Reproducing? Half correct. Women? Thank you, Ronald. Women! They put the woman there because the woman would make men decide to build society that then allowed them to then have women and perpetuate the fucking culture! Culture! Literally one of the two things and the three things that came from the Frenchmen that you call Chads! So, recently, I've seen season 1 of Castlevania Nocturne. And in Nocturne, one of the writing conventions that they chose to use is that Richter's iconic white headband was given to him by some fucking patriots that were trying to promote French involvement in politics. This is symbolism. Because technically, because they chose to place it in France, it means that Richter's headband connects to French nationalism. So, when Richter starts to take the plot lines that he's involved in more seriously as a part of his hero's journey, which he does when he gets ambushed and finally becomes Mr. Item Crashout at the lake fight with Just, the reason why he becomes so focused on now behaving like a Belmont vampire hunter is not just because his mother was the most important thing to him, and the last time he used to use magic was because he was involved with witnessing Olrox kill his mom and then tell him, I'ma kill you next, bitch, but I'ma get you later. I'ma get you later. And that cringy, lame fucking excuse of a background speech they gave him in his moment, the reason he becomes a more active part of the story instead of the framing device narrative to frame all of the bullshit that is the lore and the backdrop and the bullshit that congeals between Castlevania lore and what they chose to write for Nocturne as their hooks, including the very lame BLM politics being forced into French populism. He does so not only for the women in his life, his cousin, his cousin's mom, the Haitian slaves that he becomes friends with, but literally, 2 out of the 3 things that is a part of the fucking creed of the country. Because ultimately, Richter doesn't take it more serious until he realizes what's on the line and starts fighting for his family and for the women in his life. How did they put BLM stuff in Castlevania? Politics. Revolutionary politics. The show is written by 3 black women. Don't get me started on what they did to religion, and certainly don't get me started on what they did to my religions. Anyways, focus, lock in. You cannot complain about the story beats when you are using tropes that are older than the dirt. They love women. They love women so much that the basis of chivalry is about a man not taking advantage of women, because the kind of men that build culture in society don't rape people, they don't deal in deceit, and if they do have to use tactile and guile, it is because a capable man that can conceive of concepts, ideas, products or even children that build on that culture of society come from the basis of having parents that taught them to be smart. So those old fucking Frenchmen are mocking the fuck out of you right now. They are spinning Frenchly in the grave like bread. Because you are stupider than a French aristocrat. Unfortunately, because you don't like women. How don't you like women? Because you think that the entire point of them being there is to be a unfortunate case of them being a prize. Instead of it, and how that man acts in the context of the narrative, being the basis, not maybe in these stories overall, but in the concept of the hero's journey, a test of character. The way that the men treats the women is a test of their character. But you see, only women who hate women would not understand that a woman would be a test of a man's character. You're sure trying me!
Penetrated the tower's defenses, he woke her up. He should get the princess. From the very beginning, the rest of her life had already been chosen for her by the actions of others, without...
The point, unfortunately, on why they choose to do that as a writing narrative, Nora, is because we liked to think that men should be rewarded for things. The main idea here is delayed gratification, obviously. A man thinks that he should be fighting dragons so that he can impress women. When really, men should be fighting dragons so that when a dragon attacks, they can kill a fucking dragon! No, it is not about a webtoon. I'm pretty sure that these are illustrations that were drawn by Nora herself, which is why I made the comment earlier that if she just stopped doing all this extra shit and she just drew a fucking webcomic, she would be better suited than trying to be a fucking YouTuber. Because she doesn't have the mental capacity to do it. In my opinion. But unfortunately, she makes woman-coded content. So, women eat this shit the fuck up. Especially if they get to engage in icky concepts without having to do all the heckin' chudisms.
her having any say in it. Her happy ending is just that. Just another ending. Just another sleep like death. Which is why my favorite portrayal, critical analysis, subversion, love letter, whatever you want to call it, to Sleeping Beauty is Anti-Hemimia from Revolutionary Girl Utena.
Somebody give Saffronet a prize. She literally called it earlier back at 47:55. See, watching enough of my streams will turn you into single player, Carl. Clap and a half for Saf. Yes, Saf, she got all this shit from Revolutionary Girl Utena. I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud of that hard call from you. She read this bitch like a goddamn library, and she's got all the Monster Fucker books in her backpack. It is mandatory that you put in, it is mandatory. Where's the fucking hand clap phrase? There's one on YouTube. Let me see if I can find it. Clap. You could probably use this one. Use black skin. This would also be acceptable. Where's the other one? This one was also acceptable. I'm so impressed by you, Saf. You are learning so much. I'm so impressed by you. Anyways.
An anime from 1997 and a true goddamn masterpiece. That's right, we're doing this again.
She literally did all of this so that she could fucking glaze Revolutionary Girl Utena. She literally wrote this so that she could then fucking vibe about her favorite animes again. We're back in the fucking building! I can't leave! I can't get out! She does the same shit every time! Same shit! The same shit! It's the same shit! I'm beside myself! Moving forward.
Revolutionary Girl Utena uses fairy tale conventions and tropes to examine everything from gender roles to the patriarchy to abuse. Utena Tenjo is a very pink girl that after a formative encounter with a prince in her childhood, decided that she wanted to be just like him, and aspires to be a prince that saves damsels in distress. Her very existence defies and rejects gender norms and the school's binary dress code.
Yes, We went through all of this so she could fucking talk about Revolutionary Girl Utena. No one is more angry than I am. But you know who's very happy right now? Horror, as she sits there with a box of imaginary popcorn. You're welcome, Horror.
Sports her long pink hair with a boy's uniform jacket on top, combined with her gym shorts on the bottom. Meanwhile, Anthe, last name literally has the word princess in it, Himemia, is the Rose Bride, that qualified duelists are sword fighting for ownership of and complete possession of her, because whoever is engaged to her will receive the purposefully vague eternity, brilliance, miracles, the power to revolutionize the world. Anthe's character is introduced by being slapped by some guy, and for slightly unrelated reasons, Utena beats his ass and accidentally ends up engaged to her. And despite Utena's repeated protests that she doesn't even want to be engaged to Anthe and that she should really stop being the Rose Bride, just quit and save herself the trouble, Anthe is, seemingly, totally fine with this. This is her job. This is her role. She doesn't have an opinion one way or the other.
You cannot... Okay. I'm about to fucking lose my mind.
Totally fine with this. This is her job. This is her role. She doesn't have...
Oh, fucking... And as I just finished talking about how narrative conjecture does not work, Slay the Princess is not the same as any of the shit you've been talking about and Sailor Moon. Slay the Princess is a narrative device that is a visual novel that explains how a godlike being who somehow got split into pieces and parts is reforming with their whole self. Spoilers, by the way. I'm spoiling this. I'm spoiling this for people. I'm sorry. I have to, because what she just did was a fucking sin. Slay the Princess is not a story about a princess. It is a story about an eldritch being who's been split in half, and how it reforms into itself as you accept truths about yourself that you learn from the variants of the story that is formed by the choices and decisions that you act upon and that you work with. This is like somebody trying to make a really nouveau riche take about Undertale and not understanding that the entire point of Undertale's narrative through process is that you are actively engaging in these tropes, and that the way that the story player punches you is meant to make you choose to do the right decisions, and that the curiosity that you choose to take in doing the genocide route, or in choosing to not recognize the tropes of the story actively telling you, turn back, the reason this is so hard and that it's struggling is because you have to try hard to get here, the same way that you have to try hard to get the good ending, the golden ending, from not killing anyone. It's supposed to be a narrative conversation on how players and how they perceive the genres of games that they're in supersedes the consequences of what the story is telling them as a part of their interest in what effectively would be comparative to an ARG. They are not the same fucking thing, you goddamn bent. How... And then you have the idea that because you chose to bend the story over backwards, think that bastardizing these stories like this is the equivalent? Because I swear to fucking God, I'm going to hurt myself with how dumb you are! Unfortunately, Carmel, part of the rant is that by cutting out pieces of it, I make it funnier. Because if I don't entertain myself here, I'm gonna lose my goddamn head. And removing details makes it funnier, because I want to see if people can guess what the fuck I'm doing. So, like, you choose to amplify this. That's a great point, Saffronette. I want to know what her opinion about gushing over magical girls is. Probably that one's a little bit too guy-coded. But anyways, trying to compare Revolutionary Girl Utena and then reference Slay the Princess after referencing Sailor Moon, after referencing every other variation of story that has to deal with Sleeping Beauty is such a fucking slap in the goddamn face. Ah!
Have an opinion one way or the other. She must be engaged to whoever wins her hand in a duel, and it doesn't matter who that is, or how they treat her, or what that person might do to her. She says she doesn't want to be saved, and it's weird and concerning. Anti-Hememia is an excellent character, whose definitive quality is being passive, and so by design, we know almost nothing about her for most of the series. Revolutionary Girl Utena takes the concept of a character that doesn't do anything in her own story and runs with it, pushing that passivity to its absolute limits, until finally it reaches its, in hindsight, seemingly obvious narrative conclusion. Because, without spoiling anything, Revolutionary Girl Utena is Sleeping Beauty. Hidden deep in a forest, protected by an impenetrable barrier, stands a castle.
Is it still being spoiled? No, I have stopped spoiling Slay the Princess. So, the thing that you just explained, Nora, where they took a concept of a narrative writing process and pushed it to its conclusion, what does that sound like? Does that sound like a trope being divided, subverted, constructed, or deconstructed, and then played with as a part of the narrative? That's what you just described, Nora. So really you're upset that people don't write for feminists? I don't fucking care. End this goddamn video. I want out.
And at the top of the tallest tower is a cursed princess in a sleep like death who is waiting to be awoken by her true love, her prince. And the prince in Utena is really interesting because they split him in half. I am now absolutely certain that the creative team, B. Papas, knew about the other Sleeping Beauty variants, because this series is not just a Sleeping Beauty retelling. It is also the exact experience of growing out of childhood and learning for the first time that the fairy tale you adored, that you knew inside and out, wasn't true. The fairy tale prince, the ideal, the gentleman, noble and pure of heart who serves the ideals of chivalry, is introduced in silhouette in episode 1 via flashback. He saved Utena as a child, and she was so impressed that she thought, being a prince, honestly, seems a lot better than being a princess, so she decided to do that instead. And while I adore girl princes as much as the next person, the problem with that here is the prince isn't real. The prince is dead. He doesn't exist anymore. He's an illusion, a bedtime story. He's propaganda. The fairy tale prince is a facade worn like a mask to maintain control over others.
I love Revolutionary Girl Utena so much. I love it so much, I'm going to say that the idea of masculinity as a subservient factor of the facade of a person's personality and characteristics is just a mask. It's just a mask we use to control women's bodies. I'm gonna stray slurs again. She is unironically raping the concept of writing, and then saying, I'm doing you a favor, guys. Isn't this entertaining? I hate. I'm a hater. I'm a professional instigator.
He is beautiful, which makes him even more dangerous than the wolf. In reality, the prince is a villain, the kind of guy that wields chivalry like a knife to take advantage of both men and